They carved their stories into stone and vanished into legend. Across the windswept fjords and frozen coasts of the north, a civilization once thrived, ferocious, fearless, and far more enigmatic than history dares to admit. We know them as the Vikings, seafarers, raiders, explorers. But beyond the sagas and steel, their world is shadowed by riddles that refuse to be solved. Why do ancient Norse settlements appear in places they never should have reached? Who, or what, guided their ships through uncharted oceans with impossible precision? And what secrets lie buried beneath the collapsed longhouses, untouched burial mounds, and runestones that defy translation? Artifacts have been uncovered that rewrite timelines. Skeletons rest in graves with no known homeland, and strange alignments in Viking architecture hint at celestial knowledge far beyond their era. This is not the Viking history you were taught. This is the side that raises more questions than answers. A side of whispers, of vanished ships and gods half remembered. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into the forgotten world of unsolved Viking mysteries. The past is calling, and it doesn't always speak in runes. The wind rolls cold and restless across the coast of southwestern Greenland, sweeping over rocky cliffs and the hushed ruins of once thriving settlements. Moss creeps over the crumbled foundations of stone buildings, the skeletal remains of Norse farms that once echoed with the sounds of cattle, laughter, and the songs of a distant homeland. The land is quiet now, almost too quiet. The sea beyond still glistens under the Arctic sun, unchanged by time. But something is missing. Something unanswered. Here, nestled among fjords and narrow valleys, Norse settlers built a life in one of the harshest environments on Earth. In the late 10th century, led by Eric the Red, intrepid Icelandic families crossed treacherous waters to reach this icy frontier. They established two main colonies, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, supporting thousands of people at their peak. They brought with them the architecture, religion, and culture of medieval Scandinavia. They raised sheep, hunted seals, traded with Europe, and built churches out of cut stone, some of which still stand today, silently defying the weight of centuries. For hundreds of years, they endured. And then, they vanished. By the mid-15th century, the Greenland Norse were gone. Not conquered, not assimilated, simply gone. There are no battlefields, no mass graves, no written records describing an exodus. Just silence, and the occasional puzzled reference in foreign documents noting the colony's unexplained disappearance. So what happened? Traditional theories point to climate. The so-called Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that began in the 14th century, would have made agriculture increasingly difficult in Greenland. Shorter growing seasons, deeper snow, and colder oceans may have led to famine and the slow breakdown of Norse society. It's a plausible explanation, but is it enough? The Norse were resilient. They had survived harsh winters before. They had adapted their farming, adjusted their trade routes, and coexisted with the extremes of nature for generations. Why would they suddenly fail? Others suggest economic collapse. For years, Greenland's Norse colonies maintained trade with Europe, exporting walrus ivory, hides, and other Arctic goods in exchange for iron, timber, and grain. But by the late Middle Ages, the demand for walrus ivory declined, overtaken by elephant ivory from Africa. Trade ships arrived less frequently. Isolation deepened. Perhaps the Norse simply couldn't sustain themselves. Still, the timeline doesn't fully add up. The Western settlement vanished around 1350. The Eastern settlement lingered until around 1450. But even after trade had all but ceased, there are signs that the Eastern colony continued, quietly, independently, for nearly a century. Some of the final archaeological layers show not collapse, but continued activity. Farming, hunting, religious practice. And then, abruptly, nothing. Could they have left? Sailed away in search of a better land? It's possible. Some historians propose that a small group may have returned to Iceland or even ventured into North America, seeking refuge in the mysterious lands to the west. After all, the Norse had reached Vinland, now believed to be part of coastal Newfoundland, centuries earlier. Could remnants of the Greenland colonies have slipped away into the forested shores of the New World, leaving no trace? If so, where are the descendants? Where are the graves, the ruins, the artifacts? Could they have integrated with indigenous populations, intermarried? Or did their journey end in the unforgiving wilderness? Other theories veer further into the speculative. Some point to the Norse's staunch refusal to adopt Inuit technologies, such as the kayak or seal oil lamp, as a sign of cultural rigidity that may have led to their downfall. Did their unwillingness to adapt hasten their end? Yet others ponder darker possibilities. Could disease have swept through the colonies, carried on the breath of the North Atlantic winds, or the hulls of the last trade ships? Could internal conflict, religious upheaval, or even unknown violence have played a role? And then there are the fringe theories, whispers in the shadows of academic debate. Some claim evidence of secret voyages to the American interior, guided by ancient maps or Norse knowledge of celestial navigation. Others point to strange alignments in ruins or unexplained stone markers, suggesting that some Greenland Norse may have followed mystical beliefs or undertaken sacred journeys far beyond the known settlements. There is, of course, no proof. Only ruins, only hints. Among the most haunting remnants is the church at Valsey, the best preserved Norse structure in Greenland. It stands like a ghost on the edge of the world, and it holds the final known written record of the Norse Greenlanders, a wedding celebrated in 1408. After that, the historical trail runs cold. No more names, no more letters, no more life. The Inuit, who inhabited other parts of Greenland at the time, have no legends of a violent encounter with the Norse. In fact, archaeological evidence suggests minimal interaction at all. It's as if the Norse faded away just as silently as they had arrived, leaving their stone churches behind like monuments to a forgotten dream. So where did they go? What truly happened to the Greenland Norse? Was it slow starvation, quiet migration, or something else entirely? Centuries later, we are left with more questions than answers. And as the Arctic wind whistles through the ruined doorways and snow gathers in the hollow hearths, the silence speaks louder than any chronicle. The mystery remains, still unsolved, still waiting, and perhaps still unfolding. Just beyond the crashing tides of the North Atlantic, where the wind carries the scent of salt and pine, there lies a question that has haunted historians for centuries. Among quiet coves and windswept forests, the echoes of ancient footsteps seem to linger, elusive, half-remembered, waiting to be found. Somewhere along the coast of North America, the Norse once made landfall. They built shelters. They harvested wild grapes. They called the place Vinland. But where is it? In the early 11th century, Norse sagas tell us of bold voyages westward from Greenland. The most famous among them, Leif Erikson, sailed beyond the known world, guided by rumor, memory, and the sun's arc across open sea. What he discovered was a land unlike anything in Greenland or Iceland, rich in timber, warm enough for wheat to grow wild, and fertile with wild vines. He called it Vinland, the land of wine. For generations, this tale was treated as legend, Nordic folklore embroidered with poetic exaggeration. But the story persisted, and in time, evidence began to suggest that Vinland might have been more than just a myth. In the 1960s, Archaeologists Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad uncovered something extraordinary at Lance aux Meadows, a windswept site on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada. Beneath the soil lay the unmistakable remains of a Norse settlement. Turf walls, iron nails, boat rivets, and telltale signs of Nordic architecture from around 1000 AD. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the age. The site matched the general time frame of Leif Erikson's voyage. For many, this was the long-awaited proof. Vinland, it seemed, had been found. But the mystery didn't end there. Lance aux Meadows, while authentic, raises as many questions as it answers. The settlement is small, far too small to match the flourishing colony described in the sagas. There is little evidence of grapevines or abundant grain. Some scholars believe the site was a temporary camp, a gateway rather than a destination. If that's true, then where was the real Vinland? The Icelandic saga of the Greenlanders and saga of Eric the Red describe Leif's voyage in detail, from a stony place called Helluland, possibly Baffin Island, to a wooded coast named Markland, likely Labrador, and then farther still to a warmer, greener land with rich soil and long daylight. Could Vinland have stretched beyond Newfoundland? Some point south toward the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The climate there is more temperate, and wild grapes grow naturally in several regions. Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and even parts of New Brunswick have all been proposed. Others suggest that Norse explorers traveled even farther, down the eastern seaboard of what is now the United States. Could they have reached Maine, Massachusetts, or even farther? The sagas tell of encounters with native peoples, referred to as skrallings, some friendly, others violent. Arrowheads and tools found in certain coastal sites hint at contact between Old World and New, though few artifacts can be definitively linked to the Norse. The clues are scattered, fragmentary, like pages torn from a lost book. Mainstream archaeology treads carefully. With each proposed site, there are challenges, gaps in evidence, dating inconsistencies, environmental mismatches. The truth remains stubbornly elusive. And yet, the theories continue. Some researchers have proposed sites along the Hudson River Valley, where wild grapes grow in abundance and the terrain aligns with saga descriptions. Others have turned to satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar to search for Norse-style structures hidden beneath forest and soil. More speculative voices point to stone structures, petroglyphs, or rune-like carvings found in inland North America, though many of these have been dismissed as hoaxes or misinterpretations. Still, they add to the air of mystery, the tantalizing possibility that something has been missed. Could Vinland have been a series of seasonal camps rather than a single settlement? A broader region, not a fixed point? The Norse were seafarers. They traveled light, moved often, and left little behind. Perhaps Vinland wasn't a city, but a concept. A promise of land just over the horizon. And what of the sagas themselves? They were written down centuries after the events they describe. They mix history with myth, fact with folklore. Yet, time and again, archaeology has revealed kernels of truth within their pages. If the sagas preserved the memory of Vinland, what else might they tell us? If we know how to listen. Then there's the matter of the maps. A controversial artifact known as the Vinland Map surfaced in the mid-20th century, allegedly dating to the 15th century, and depicting part of North America labeled Vinlanda Insula. Long thought to be a medieval confirmation of Norse discovery, the map has since been largely discredited as a 20th century forgery. But its existence stirred debate, and it continues to raise questions about what medieval Europeans may have known about lands across the Atlantic, long before Columbus. Today, the search for Vinland is no longer just about Leif Erikson. It's a search for understanding of how cultures meet, how memory survives, and how history leaves its trace on the land. The forests of the northeast remain thick with secrets. Rivers still carve their way through hills once seen by unknown eyes. Somewhere out there, beneath layers of earth, hidden in coastal inlets or swallowed by time, there may yet be the remains of Norse walls, Norse tools, Norse dreams. So, was Vinland a real colony, or a mythologized memory of brief exploration? Did the Norse leave behind more than we've discovered? Or have the traces of their journey been erased by centuries of forest, frost, and forgetfulness? The question remains open, and the silence of the coast whispers still. A low mist clings to the earth in Kattegat's rugged hills, thick, quiet, and pale in the dim northern light. Somewhere beyond the tree line, black stones rise from the soil, their runes weathered by centuries of wind and rain. These are lands steeped in memory, where myth and history still entwine like the roots beneath ancient oaks. And in the shadows of that blurred frontier stands a name: Ragnar Lothbrok. Warrior, king, raider, legend. But was he ever real? The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok is one of the most captivating tales of the Viking Age. He appears in medieval Norse poetry, Icelandic sagas, and later historical chronicles, depicted as a fearless warlord who sailed west to raid England and France, married the beautiful shield maiden Lagertha, and fathered sons whose names thunder through Viking history: Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Sigurd Snake in the Eye. His story is one of valor and vengeance, of dragon slaying and divine ancestry. According to some sources, Ragnar was a direct descendant of Odin, the All-Father himself. According to others, he met his death in a pit of vipers, thrown there by the Northumbrian king Ella after a failed invasion. But here is where the mystery deepens. The earliest records that mention Ragnar by name were written centuries after the time he supposedly lived. The Icelandic Ragnar's saga Lothbrok, compiled in the 13th century, reads more like epic fiction than verifiable history. And yet, many of Ragnar's supposed sons, unlike the man himself, are referenced in contemporary records. So, who was Ragnar Lothbrok? Was he a real Viking chieftain whose deeds were later exaggerated, a symbolic figure used to unify disparate legends? Or a complete invention of medieval storytellers, retroactively inserted into a past that needed a hero? Let's begin with what we do know. In the late 9th century, a fearsome army known as the Great Heathen Army invaded Anglo-Saxon England. Historical sources, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, mention leaders with names like Ivar, Halfdan, and Ubba. These men are described as sons of Ragnar, seeking revenge for their father's death at the hands of King Ella of Northumbria. Interestingly, King Ella also appears in several Norse sagas as the one who executed Ragnar, though those sagas were written long after Ella's own death. Could the chroniclers have been working backward? Could the story of Ragnar have been invented after the invasion to give his sons a motive, a mythic lineage? Or was Ragnar real, and his sons simply preserved the legacy he left behind? Some historians believe Ragnar was a composite figure, stitched together from multiple historical individuals. One candidate is Ragnar, a Viking leader who famously besieged Paris in 845 AD during the reign of Charles the Bald. Contemporary Frankish annals describe Ragnar leading a fleet of 120 ships up the Seine and exacting tribute from the terrified French king before withdrawing. Ragnar, some argue, may be Ragnar, or at least the seed from which his legend grew. Other scholars point to the warrior Ragnar, or even the semi-legendary Ragnar Ua Ymir, whose dynastic links appear in Irish and Scottish records. Could these men be echoes of the same mythic archetype? Or were they individuals whose names and deeds were later blended into the ever-expanding tale of Lothbrok? The name Lothbrok itself offers clues. In Old Norse, it likely translates to hairy breeches, supposedly referring to the animal hide trousers Ragnar wore while fighting a dragon in one tale. Whether this was a mark of distinction or the result of poetic invention is unclear. But it does suggest that even in origin, Ragnar's image was shaped by allegory as much as fact. Still, the core of his legend persists across cultures. Saxon, Norman, and Icelandic sources all refer to a Ragnar figure in some form. In each case, he is a raider from the sea, a scourge of kings, and the father of legendary sons. The consistency is curious. Coincidence? Or evidence of a real historical figure whose fame stretched across Europe, only to be mythologized by later generations? Some fringe theories go further. They suggest Ragnar was not just a Viking leader, but a cipher, a symbolic avatar representing the Viking age itself, a fusion of ancestral memory, cultural pride, and pagan cosmology. In this reading, Ragnar is not one man, but every man, a stand-in for countless warriors who crossed the sea and changed history. Others search for him in the archaeological record. Burial sites in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden have yielded richly adorned graves from the 9th and 10th centuries, some with weapons, boats, and offerings that suggest high status. Could one of these be Ragnar's final resting place? Or would a man like Ragnar, if he existed at all, have died on foreign soil, far from home, lost to the mists of time? Even today, the story of Ragnar continues to evolve. Popular culture has breathed new life into his myth. Television shows, novels, and games reimagine him as a complex anti-hero, part philosopher, part warrior, part god. But the question of his identity remains unresolved. The lines between truth and tale remain blurred. Perhaps that's why his legend endures. Because Ragnar Lothbrok is more than a name in a saga. He is a mirror of the age he represents. An age of fire and ice, of gods and kings, of ambition and exile. Whether he lived as a man or only as a story, he refuses to be forgotten. So we are left to wonder, was Ragnar the ghost of a single man, the echo of many, or a fiction born of collective memory? The wind over the old stones offers no answer, and in that silence, the legend lives on. At the northern tip of Newfoundland, where the Atlantic wind stirs low grasses and fog curls over the sea, a quiet landscape hides a story nearly forgotten. The coastline is rugged, with jagged rocks jutting from dark, frigid waters. The earth here is soft and spongy, interrupted by low mounds, barely visible signs of something ancient, something human. Amid the silence, it's hard to imagine that this place once echoed with the clang of hammers, the murmur of foreign voices, and the creak of wooden beams shaped by Viking hands. This is Meadows, a name that now rests at the intersection of myth and archaeology. In 1960, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife, archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, followed the trail of Viking sagas to this remote corner of North America. Guided by local knowledge and a sense of historical intuition, they uncovered what had long been thought impossible: a Norse settlement on the North American continent, centuries before Columbus ever crossed the Atlantic. Beneath centuries of soil, the outlines of turf buildings emerged, longhouses built in the distinctive Icelandic style. Inside were iron nails, forged rivets, a bronze cloak pin, and a spindle whorl, all unmistakably Norse. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the site's age, around the year 1000 AD. For the first time, physical evidence validated the saga accounts of Leif Erikson's voyage to a mysterious land called Vinland. But while the discovery offered answers, it also opened a door to deeper questions. The settlement is small, just 8 buildings. There are no sprawling farmlands, no signs of permanent occupation. Some archaeologists believe it was a short-term base, used for exploration or as a staging point for further travel south. Others suggest it may have been a seasonal camp, visited repeatedly over years or even decades. But what remains unclear is what exactly the Norse hoped to accomplish here, and why they left. Why would Norse explorers sail thousands of kilometers to establish a modest outpost in such an isolated place, only to abandon it within a few years? The sagas offer tantalizing clues. They describe Vinland as rich in resources, timber, salmon, and wild grapes. But Meadows is cold and stark, especially compared to the more fertile regions farther south. Did Leif Erikson and his crew mistake Newfoundland for a greater land beyond? Or was this site merely the edge of a larger, now lost Norse presence in North America? There are other hints, unresolved, intriguing. The ironworking found at Meadows is particularly significant. The Norse didn't merely repair tools here, they smelted bog iron from scratch, an operation requiring time, labor, and intent. This wasn't a brief stopover. Someone meant to stay, at least for a while. And then there are the paths not yet fully traced. Some researchers argue that the Norse may have ventured much farther than we've proven. The saga of the Greenlanders describes multiple expeditions, including ones that encountered indigenous peoples and traveled through different climate zones. The question lingers, is Meadows a singular footprint, or just the only one we've found so far? A few fringe theories take this further, proposing Norse presence in places as distant as the Hudson River Valley, the Great Lakes, or even the Mississippi River Basin. Carvings, stone structures, and runes of dubious origin have been cited as possible evidence, though none have gained scholarly consensus. Still, the possibility nags at the edges of the known. Could the Norse have explored deep into the continent, only to vanish without a lasting mark? Even the name Vinland itself invites speculation. The sagas describe a land where wild grapes grow in abundance. But no such plants are native to northern Newfoundland. Did the name refer to another site, now lost? Or was Vinland never a precise location, but a symbolic name, a land of promise, warmth, and possibility? And what of the sudden abandonment? No signs of violence or destruction have been found at Meadows. The structures were left intact, the tools seemingly set aside rather than buried in haste. It feels more like a quiet departure than a disaster. But why? Did conflicts with indigenous peoples drive the Norse away? Or did the harsh winters, the distance from Greenland, and the difficulty of supply routes make the settlement unsustainable? Perhaps news from home, the decline of Greenland's own Norse communities, pulled them back. Or perhaps they simply gave up the dream. There is also the spiritual dimension. One of the saga accounts mentions Thorvald, the son of Eric the Red, being killed by a native arrow and buried in a beautiful headland, a place still unidentified. Somewhere, perhaps beneath the trees or tundra of eastern Canada, there may be Norse graves waiting to be rediscovered. For now, Meadows remains the only confirmed site, a solitary outpost at the edge of a continent, a moment frozen in time. And yet, as you walk the narrow paths between its sod-covered reconstructions, there's a sense of something more, something still hidden beneath layers of soil and time. The sagas speak with poetry, not precision. The archaeology is solid, but incomplete, and the silence of the North continues to guard its secrets. What else lies waiting along the shorelines and forests of Atlantic Canada? Were there other camps, other travelers, other stories that never made it into the sagas? The mystery of Meadows is not just in what was found, but in what remains missing, and perhaps in what was never meant to be found at all. It lies beneath layers of earth and centuries of silence, a sword, perfectly balanced, its blade straight and narrow, its hilt rusted with age. Along the fuller, etched in ancient steel, are 2 lines of letters, Ulfberht plus, simple, stark, and profoundly mysterious. Discovered in riverbeds, burial mounds, and forgotten battlefields across Europe, these swords bear a name that has puzzled historians for decades. The Ulfberht swords, over 170 known specimens, are unlike any other weapons of the Viking Age. Their craftsmanship is far beyond what was believed possible for the time. The mystery isn't just in their superior construction, it's in how and where they were made. Who, or what, was Ulfberht? Forged between the 8th and 11th centuries, these swords have turned up from Scandinavia to the banks of the Volga River. Most were found in the heartlands of the Viking world, buried with warriors or pulled from the depths of ancient rivers. At first glance, they appear similar to other Viking swords: cruciform hilts, double-edged blades, and a functional utilitarian design. But under closer inspection, something startling emerges. The metal of the Ulfberht swords is of a quality centuries ahead of its time. While most European swords of the era were made from bloomery iron, impure and brittle, the Ulfberht blades were forged with crucible steel, a metal requiring knowledge of high-temperature smelting and carbon control. The result is a sword with fewer impurities, greater strength, and extraordinary flexibility. A weapon that could bend without breaking, slice without dulling. Such metallurgical precision would not be seen again in Europe until the rise of industrial steelmaking nearly 800 years later. So how did Viking Age swordsmiths acquire or develop this technology? The signature + Ulfberht plus appears inlaid in the blade, likely with molten iron or silver. Some believe it was a maker's mark, possibly the name of a master smith or a monastic workshop. Others argue it was more than that, a brand, a symbol of excellence, perhaps even a sacred or political seal. But here's where the story takes a strange turn. Not all Ulfberht swords are created equal. Some are indeed made of high-quality crucible steel, sourced from far beyond Europe, possibly from Central Asia, Persia, or India, where advanced steelmaking techniques had existed for centuries. Others, however, are poor imitations, crudely forged, with inferior materials, yet still stamped with the same revered inscription. Were these counterfeits? Mass-market imitations for warriors seeking status without substance? Or were different swordsmiths using the name Ulfberht across generations, an early medieval trademark perhaps passed down or exploited? The very spelling of the name adds to the intrigue. Some swords read + Ulfberht plus, clean and consistent. Others show variations, misspelled versions, missing crosses, or distorted letter forms. This inconsistency suggests that by the 10th and 11th centuries, the name may have become detached from its original source, copied and recopied by smiths who no longer understood its meaning, but recognized its power. If the early Ulfberht swords were truly made with imported crucible steel, it raises deeper questions. How did this material make its way into the hands of Norse or Frankish swordsmiths? At the time, crucible steel, known historically as woots, was produced in parts of what is now India, Iran, and Central Asia. It was traded along the Silk Road and through Islamic territories, but its arrival in Northern Europe remains poorly understood. Did Viking traders bring it back through their vast networks? The Norse were known to reach as far as Byzantium and the Caliphate. Could they have encountered the secrets of Eastern metallurgy and brought them home? Some scholars propose that the earliest Ulfberht blades may have originated not in Scandinavia, but in the Frankish Empire, specifically in monasteries along the Rhine. These centers were not just places of worship, but of learning and craftsmanship, capable of producing luxury goods and weaponry. It's possible the name Ulfberht referred to a Frankish abbot or nobleman overseeing such production. But if the swords came from Francia, how did they end up buried with Viking warriors? This points to a strange historical paradox. According to edicts issued by Frankish kings such as Charles the Bald, the sale of swords to pagans, especially Vikings, was strictly prohibited. Yet dozens of Ulfberht swords have been found in Norse graves. Smuggled, looted, or perhaps traded through covert channels by merchants who valued silver over loyalty. More speculative theories venture further. Some suggest that the technology behind the Ulfberht swords was the result of a lost tradition, an ancient knowledge preserved through secretive guilds or monastic orders. Others propose a connection to Templar or pre-Templar networks, linking metallurgy to esoteric knowledge passed down from Eastern initiates. These ideas remain on the margins, but they speak to the enduring allure of the unknown. What remains unchallenged, however, is the sword's superiority. Modern metallurgical analysis has confirmed that the best of the Ulfberht swords contain steel with carbon contents as high as 1.0%, far beyond anything European smiths were believed capable of producing at the time. Some blades show uniform carbon distribution and structural integrity approaching modern standards. The techniques required to forge such weapons would not reappear in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. So, who was Ulfberht? Was it one man, a family of smiths, a monastic workshop guarding ancient trade secrets? Or was it simply a name that came to stand for excellence, a banner under which the finest blades of a generation were forged? We may never know. Today, the Ulfberht swords remain scattered across museums and private collections, silent, gleaming relics of a forgotten mastery. Each blade is a puzzle, every rune a question. They invite us not only to admire their brilliance, but to wonder. What knowledge was lost with the last true Ulfberht swordsmith? And what else, buried in the soil of northern Europe, waits to be discovered, still bearing a name that echoes from the age of iron and fire? In the dim quiet of an old Icelandic archive, yellowed parchment rests beneath glass. The letters, carefully inked by hand nearly 800 years ago, curve and coil in the flowing script of a long-dead scribe. These are not merely words, they are echoes. Fragments of a distant time when the world was still full of uncharted oceans, foreign peoples, and lands that existed only in whispers. The manuscripts are known as the Vinland Sagas, and they tell of something astonishing: a Viking voyage across the Atlantic. The saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red recount journeys far beyond the icy shores of Greenland to a mysterious land rich with grapes, wild game, and warm, fertile soil. The Norse called it Vinland, the land of wine. These accounts speak of explorers like Leif Erikson, Thorvald, Freydis, and Thorfinn Karlsefni, names that today carry both the weight of history and the haze of legend. But can these sagas be trusted? On the surface, the texts read like epic adventure stories, tales of courage, danger, and cultural encounters in a new world. And yet, hidden beneath their dramatic narrative lies the question that has captivated historians for generations. Are the sagas history or myth? Let's begin with what we know. The Vinland Sagas were written down in the 13th century, centuries after the events they describe. They were preserved in Iceland, passed from storyteller to scribe in a society that valued oral tradition as much as written record. In a world without printing presses, stories were alive, told aloud, reshaped with each retelling. Memory and embellishment were inseparable. Yet certain elements of the sagas align uncannily with modern archaeological discoveries. The mention of a voyage west from Greenland to a land called Helluland, a rocky coast, likely Baffin Island. Then to Markland, a wooded shore, perhaps Labrador. And finally, Vinland, warmer, fertile, and abundant. In 1960, the discovery of the Norse settlement at Lons o Meadows provided the first hard evidence of such voyages, confirming that Viking explorers did indeed reach the North American continent around the year 1000 AD. This much is fact. But the sagas go further, describing extensive interactions with indigenous peoples, whom they call Skrælings, internal disputes among the Norse, even pregnancies and children born in this distant land. One child, Snorri, is said to have been the first European born in the New World. The level of detail is striking, too precise, perhaps, for complete invention. So where does that leave us? Some historians argue that the sagas preserve genuine oral accounts of real events, but refracted through generations of storytelling. Like ripples on water, the farther from the source, the more distorted the reflection. Details might be rearranged, roles shifted, motives simplified. The skeleton of truth may remain, but the flesh of memory is soft. Others suggest a more skeptical view. The 13th century was a time of cultural transformation in Iceland, pagan traditions giving way to Christianity, oral history giving way to written law. Could the sagas have been shaped by contemporary agendas? Perhaps they were intended to glorify certain families or figures, to preserve cultural identity in a world that was rapidly changing. Even the name Vinland carries ambiguity. The sagas describe wild grapes growing freely, yet such plants don't exist in northern Newfoundland, where Lons o Meadows is located. Did the name refer instead to another region farther south? Or was wine symbolic, representing fertility, abundance, or even spiritual reward? And then there are the inconsistencies. The saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red differ in key areas. One claims Leif Erikson discovered Vinland accidentally. The other says he planned the voyage. One presents Freydis as a violent instigator. The other, a brave woman facing hostile attackers. Even the number of expeditions, the names of crew members, and the outcomes of key encounters vary. Are these contradictions evidence of fabrication, or simply the natural divergence of oral accounts across generations? Some scholars believe the answer lies not in proving or disproving the sagas entirely, but in reading them as layered texts, part history, part folklore, part cultural memory. In this view, the sagas are not meant to be factual records, but truthful ones in a deeper sense, preserving the emotional and symbolic truths of a people grappling with new frontiers, real or imagined. There are also those who ask more radical questions. Could there have been other Norse expeditions, now lost to time, that reached farther, stayed longer, or left subtler marks on the land? The sagas may represent only a fraction of the Norse presence in North America. Some researchers have searched for signs of Vinland in Nova Scotia, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, even parts of New England. Oral traditions among indigenous groups have been studied for hints of early European contact. Stone structures, inscriptions, and place names have all been cited as possible clues, though most remain unverified. Still, the timing is curious. The sagas describe a vibrant, resource-rich land, a place that inspired hope and struggle. And yet, just a few decades later, the trail grows cold. No permanent colony, no lasting imprint, just silence. Did the Norse give up on Vinland? Did they encounter resistance too great to overcome? Or did something happen that the sagas chose not to record? Perhaps the truth of the Vinland sagas lies not in their exact chronology or geographic accuracy, but in the world they open, a glimpse into Viking ambition, curiosity, and the deep longing to reach beyond the horizon. A reminder that history is not always written in stone, but in the stories people choose to remember. And so we ask, what else might the sagas be trying to tell us, and what remains lost, between the lines, in the gaps, and in the silence left behind? The ink has faded. The stories remain, and the land they speak of may still be waiting. In the cold northern reaches of the Atlantic, where the sea blends into the sky in a muted blur of mist and cloud, navigation becomes an act of faith. The sun, often veiled behind dense fog or hidden by overcast skies, offers no guiding light. And yet, the Vikings, in their open ships, traversed these treacherous waters with uncanny precision, sailing thousands of miles across the open ocean to reach the British Isles, Greenland, and even the distant shores of North America. How did they find their way? Among the most curious clues lies a translucent crystal, small enough to fit in the palm of your hand, smooth, warm to the touch, with a subtle shimmer that shifts as it catches the light. It is known as a sunstone, and its purpose, though still debated, may hold the key to one of the great mysteries of Viking navigation. The sunstone first appears in the Icelandic sagas, not as a mythical object, but in passing mention, almost as a commonplace tool. In the Raudulf's Thatr, an obscure 13th century narrative, King Olaf of Norway is said to use a stone to locate the sun's position on a cloudy day. No magic, no ceremony, just practical use. A subtle detail, but one that modern science would take centuries to understand. For a long time, the reference was dismissed as legend or poetic flourish. It seemed implausible. How could a simple stone reveal the location of the sun when even the naked eye could not? And then came the science. In the late 20th century, physicists began to explore a phenomenon known as birefringence, a property found in certain crystals like Iceland spar, a form of clear calcite. When light passes through this mineral, it splits into two rays, creating a double image. By rotating the crystal and observing the orientation where the two images align, one can pinpoint the direction of polarized sunlight, even when the sun itself is hidden. Could this be the elusive sunstone? Experiments conducted in recent years suggest it's possible. Even under overcast skies, where sunlight is diffused, polarized light remains detectable. With the right technique, a skilled navigator using an Iceland spar crystal could estimate the sun's position with surprising accuracy, within a few degrees. This would allow a seafarer to determine true east or west, vital for maintaining course across the open sea. But if this knowledge was available to the Vikings, where did it come from? No sunstones have ever been found in confirmed Viking graves or settlements. The sagas reference them, and medieval travelers may have used them, but the physical evidence remains elusive. In 2013, archaeologists discovered a calcite crystal on a 16th century English shipwreck, the Alderney, leading some to speculate that the technology may have persisted quietly for centuries. But this artifact lies long after the Viking Age had ended. Is it possible that Viking navigators used sunstones as an oral, closely guarded tradition, never recorded in physical form? Or were they using something else entirely? Perhaps not Iceland spar, but a different mineral with similar properties, now lost or misidentified. Some researchers have proposed alternative materials, cordierite or tourmaline, both birefringent and known in Northern Europe. Could these have served the same function? Were multiple types of sunstones in circulation, with knowledge passed by word of mouth among navigators and kept secret from outsiders? Others suggest the sunstone may have been more than just a tool. In Norse cosmology, the sun held sacred significance. Sun disks, solar motifs, and references to light and shadow abound in Viking art and mythology. Could the sunstone have had both practical and ritual value, a navigational aid, and a spiritual compass? Fringe theories go further, linking the sunstone to the so-called Viking compass, or sun compass, a wooden disc with a central gnomon that could track the sun's shadow over time. Though no such device has been definitively tied to Viking culture, similar instruments have been proposed in reconstructions. Some even argue that when used together, a sunstone and a sun compass, Viking navigators could determine not only direction but latitude. And yet, no complete navigational toolkit from the Viking Age has ever been discovered. No sunstones labeled, no manuals of use. The mystery remains. Did the Vikings use sunstones regularly, or were they rare and experimental? Were they common knowledge among seafarers, or reserved for the most elite navigators? Or perhaps the Sagas, even in their casual reference, were remembering a technique already fading, a glimpse of lost knowledge from an earlier generation. One thing is clear: the Viking ability to sail vast distances across featureless waters long before compasses or charts was not luck, it was skill. Whether that skill came from celestial observation, wind and wave reading, migratory birds, or perhaps a translucent stone held up to a sunless sky, remains an open question. Today, in museums and labs, fragments of calcite rest under modern scrutiny. Researchers recreate ancient voyages using stone and sun and sea. And slowly, a picture begins to emerge. Not definitive, not final, but compelling. Was the sunstone real? Or are we looking through a lens of hope, seeking a simple answer to a sophisticated question? In the end, the stone itself may not be the heart of the mystery. It is the silence it leaves behind, the gaps in record, the missing artifacts, the unspoken knowledge of those who once crossed oceans without fear. Somewhere between legend and lost science lies the truth, and perhaps one day we will lift the final veil and see the sun, as they once did. The wind whispers through spruce and pine along the northern coastlines of Atlantic Canada. Salt hangs heavy in the air, and the gray sea crashes against worn cliffs. The land feels ancient, untouched, and wild, yet hidden beneath the moss and soil, evidence stirs. Long ago, before Columbus, before the Spanish fleets, before European colonies lined these shores, strangers arrived. They came in ships with curved prows and square sails, crafted from oak and bound with iron rivets. Their sails billowed with the cold wind of the North Atlantic. Their hulls creaked with the weight of ambition. These were Norsemen, Vikings, and they had crossed the sea. Meadows, on the tip of Newfoundland, remains the only widely accepted Norse site in the New World, dated to around 1000 AD. A UNESCO World Heritage Site, now, it confirms what the Icelandic sagas suggested all along, that Viking explorers, likely under the leadership of Leif Erikson, reached North America centuries before any other Europeans. But the site is small, a cluster of turf structures, evidence of ironworking, simple tools. It hints at a temporary presence, perhaps seasonal, perhaps exploratory, a base camp on the edge of a greater world. And from there, the mystery begins to widen, because the sagas describe more than just a fleeting visit. They speak of Helluland, a land of flat stones, likely Baffin Island, of Markland, rich in forests, possibly Labrador, and Vinland, warm, fertile, abundant with game and wild grapes. Yet Meadows, though real, doesn't match the vivid bounty described in the texts. Were the sagas exaggerating, misremembering? Or could they be pointing to other sites, further south, still waiting to be discovered? Some believe they might. Over the past century, rumors and clues have emerged across North America, enigmatic signs of a Norse presence beyond Newfoundland. In Nova Scotia, stone foundations and alleged mooring stones have sparked debate. Along the coast of Maine and Massachusetts, reports have surfaced of unusual petroglyphs and possible boat landings. A handful of controversial artifacts, stone carvings, iron nails, even runic inscriptions, have been found from the Great Lakes region to the Mississippi Valley. Could these be evidence of a broader Viking footprint? One of the most famous and contentious examples is the Kensington runestone, discovered in 1898 in Minnesota. The stone bears a runic inscription dated to 1362, describing a Norse expedition into the interior of North America. Mainstream scholars have dismissed it as a 19th century hoax, citing linguistic anomalies and lack of corroborating evidence. Yet some researchers continue to argue for its authenticity, pointing to overlooked details in the runes and context. There are also the Newport Tower in Rhode Island, often claimed to be a Norse structure due to its round stone design, and the Heavener runestone in Oklahoma, another controversial artifact carved with runic characters. None of these finds have been conclusively linked to Norse explorers, but their existence feeds a persistent question. Could the Vikings have traveled farther than we've ever confirmed? Supporting such theories is the undeniable fact that the Norse were formidable navigators. They reached the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and from there, North America. Their ships were swift and seaworthy, and their exploration was driven not just by conquest, but by trade, resources, and curiosity. Given their capabilities, it is not unreasonable to imagine they could have sailed deeper into the rivers and coasts of eastern North America. But if they did, why have we not found more? The Viking settlements in Greenland lasted centuries, yet left only sparse remains. The Norse often built with turf and wood, materials that decay rapidly in the North American climate. If their presence was brief or seasonal, as many believe, much of it could have vanished without a trace. Or perhaps, like at Meadows, traces still lie buried, overlooked, or misinterpreted. There is also the question of contact. The sagas mention conflicts and exchanges with indigenous peoples, whom they called Skrylings. Were there more interactions than we know? Could Norse influence have quietly passed into native oral traditions, languages, or artifacts, undetected by conventional archaeology? Some indigenous stories do include vague accounts of pale-skinned visitors arriving by sea, bearing iron and strange weapons. These stories are difficult to date and often interwoven with other cultural elements. But they invite reflection. How many traces of ancient contact lie hidden not in the soil, but in memory? Mainstream scholars urge caution. The leap from myth to history is perilous, and without solid evidence, radiocarbon dating, artifacts, consistent material culture, the broader Viking presence in the Americas remains speculative. Many of the more extreme claims lack context, verification, or peer review. Still, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Meadows was once a theory too. For centuries, the sagas were dismissed as fantasy until a single excavation reshaped what we thought we knew. Could the same happen again? What if Vinland is out there, larger, richer, and still waiting to be uncovered? What if Norse explorers, driven by curiosity and survival, pushed far beyond the limits we've assumed? What if the next major archaeological discovery lies not in Europe, but deep in the forests, rivers, or coastlines of the American continent? For now, the trail remains cold. The sagas whisper. The land is silent. And the truth, whatever it may be, remains hidden beneath centuries of moss, soil, and forgotten time. On the remote western edge of Scotland, windswept and rugged, lies the Isle of Lewis, a place of stark beauty and ancient silence. Here, among moorlands and cliffs battered by Atlantic storms, the earth once yielded a secret. Buried beneath the sands of a dune near Whig Bay, a hoard of objects, small, carved, strangely alive, waited to be found. It was 1831 when a local crofter uncovered them, 93 pieces in total, made of walrus ivory and whale tooth, carved with exquisite precision. Kings and queens, bishops and knights, rooks shaped like grim, battle-ready warriors, pawns, simple, stout, without flourish. Together, they form one of the most iconic medieval artifacts ever discovered, the Lewis Chessmen. And yet, their origin remains uncertain. At first glance, the chess pieces reflect the Norse world. Their armor, cloaks, and expressions speak of a time when Vikings still ruled the northern seas. Most scholars agree that the Lewis chessmen were likely crafted in the late 12th century during the height of the Norse presence in the British Isles. But who carved them? And how did they come to be buried in such a remote, wind-swept corner of Scotland? The prevailing theory places their origin in Norway, possibly in Trondheim, a thriving medieval city and ecclesiastical center. This would make sense. The craftsmanship is advanced, suggesting skilled artisans familiar with Christian iconography and Northern European style. And during the 12th century, the Hebrides, including the Isle of Lewis, were under the influence of the Norwegian crown. Yet questions linger. No workshop in Trondheim has ever been definitively linked to the chessmen. No similar pieces have been found in mainland Norway, not in such number, nor with such artistic coherence. If these were mass-produced trade goods, why have we not found other sets? And then there is their sudden, unexplained burial. The pieces were found in a small stone cist, as if intentionally hidden. Was the hoard lost? Forgotten by a traveling merchant? Buried for safekeeping during a time of conflict? Or were they left as part of a ritual, an offering, perhaps, to gods old or new? Adding to the mystery is the emotional depth etched into the figures. The kings sit solemnly, their eyes wide, thoughtful, brooding. The queens hold a hand to their cheek, a gesture of contemplation or concern carved with unexpected tenderness. The bishops, rare in chess sets of this period, suggest a strong Christian context. But the most arresting pieces are the rooks, each shaped like a berserker, a warrior with bared teeth, biting the rim of his shield in a frenzy of battle lust. They seem out of place in a game of strategy and calm, more myth than metaphor. Who imagined them this way? Could the set represent more than a game? Might it encode a worldview, perhaps even a hidden commentary on kingship, warfare, or faith? And what of the materials? Most of the pieces are carved from walrus ivory, precious, difficult to obtain. Some believe this hints at a connection to Greenland, where Norse settlers once harvested walrus for trade. In fact, recent chemical analysis of the ivory has pointed to Arctic origins, possibly Western Greenland or Iceland. If true, this would expand the chessmen's journey across the North Atlantic. Could they have been carved in the colonies? Shipped from Greenland to Norway, then brought to the Hebrides as trade goods or diplomatic gifts? Or could the carvers have been Norse artisans living in the colonies themselves? This idea opens more speculative paths. In the Norse Greenland settlements, high-status objects have been found: crosses, beads, jewelry, suggesting a community that valued connection with the wider world. If a master carver lived among them, could the Lewis chessmen be the only surviving trace of their craftsmanship? Might they represent the final flourish of a fading Norse outpost? One last burst of artistry before disappearance? There are even fringe theories. Some propose the chessmen were made in the British Isles, perhaps by Norse Gaelic artisans in Orkney or the Isle of Man, regions where Viking and Celtic cultures fused in complex ways. The hybrid styles seen in the pieces, especially the mixture of Christian and pagan imagery, might support this. Others speculate on the possibility of secret codes embedded in the arrangement or symbolism of the pieces, though no such system has been proven. Still, the chessmen keep their secrets. Today, most of the set resides in the British Museum, with a smaller group in the National Museum of Scotland. Visitors stare at their intricate faces, transfixed by their quiet, haunting presence. They feel familiar, recognizably human, yet curiously distant, as though they belong to a world we almost remember, but can never quite touch. Were they made for play? For display? Or for something else entirely? And who was meant to hold them? A merchant? A warlord? A bishop traveling between kingdoms? Or someone now forgotten, their story swallowed by the sea and soil? In the end, the Lewis chessmen remain more than artifacts. They are fragments of a vanished world, Norse yet Christian, martial yet contemplative. Their eyes, wide and watchful, seem almost aware of their own mystery, as if waiting for the rest of the story to be told. What hand buried them? What mind conceived them? And what other treasures, lost to time, still lie beneath the moors and stones of the north, waiting to be uncovered? The earth in Birka is quiet, a gentle rise in the Swedish landscape, now softened by time, grass, and centuries of silence. Once, this was one of the most important Viking trading hubs in the north, a bustling center of commerce, culture, and power. Today, only grassy mounds remain, scattered across the island of Björka in Lake Mälaren, each one concealing a story lost to the winds. But beneath one of those mounds, grave BJ581, a discovery was made that would challenge long-held assumptions about Viking society. Excavated in the late 19th century by Swedish archaeologist Hjalmar Stolpe, the grave contained a striking assemblage. A full set of weapons, including a sword, axe, spear, arrows, and a battle knife. 2 horses, a stallion and a mare, lay beside the deceased, a traditional symbol of martial prestige. The individual was buried with gaming pieces and a game board, suggesting strategic thinking, perhaps the mind of a military commander. For over a century, the burial was catalogued, studied, and cited as the final resting place of a high-ranking male warrior, an archetypal Viking leader. But in 2017, a new layer of the mystery was revealed. Through DNA analysis of the remains, researchers discovered something unexpected. The warrior was female. This revelation sent ripples through the academic world and beyond. Could a woman truly have held such a position of status and military command in Viking society? The evidence, now seemingly plain, was suddenly open to deeper scrutiny. Was this warrior an exception, or part of a broader, largely unrecorded tradition? Historians have long debated the role of women in Viking culture. While sagas and historical texts mention shield maidens, female warriors who fought alongside men, many have regarded them as symbolic or mythic figures. Tales like that of Lagertha, said to have fought with Ragnar Lothbrok, are rich with drama but poor in verifiable fact. The Birka burial forced scholars to reconsider those assumptions. The contents of the grave suggest this was not merely a woman buried with weapons. The arrangement, the presence of strategic gaming pieces, the quality and variety of weaponry, the positioning of the horses, implies someone of notable rank. Not just a fighter, but a commander, a tactician, perhaps even a leader of men. But not everyone agrees. Some critics questioned whether the burial had been misinterpreted. Could the weapons have symbolic significance rather than practical use? Might the woman have been a member of the elite, buried with the trappings of war to honor her family rather than her own deeds? Others wondered whether the remains had been mixed with those of a male warrior during excavation. Further study, however, confirmed the integrity of the grave. The bones were those of a single individual, undeniably female, and the grave goods matched those traditionally associated with elite warriors. Isotopic analysis even suggests she had traveled widely, consistent with someone of military experience or diplomatic importance. Still, questions persist. Who was she? Was she born into a warrior lineage? Did she lead troops in defense of Birka or fight in raids across the Baltic? Was she celebrated in her time? or hidden by later generations uncomfortable with her role? And what of her legacy? Could there have been more women like her, skilled, trained, and commanding respect on the battlefield, whose stories were never written down, or were erased as Viking society Christianized and gender roles solidified? Some scholars now point to other burials across Scandinavia that may need to be re-evaluated. Graves previously classified as male based on weapon presence are being reconsidered, with biological testing offering new insights. Could the Birka warrior be the first of many? Others explore the idea that the Viking Age, often romanticized for its violence and adventure, may have also allowed for more fluid roles, where ability, not just gender, determined one's path. In that light, the Birka female warrior becomes not a curiosity, but a symbol of a society more complex than we have imagined. There are even those who speculate more widely. Could she have been part of a secretive warrior class? A cultic order of shield maidens, perhaps, trained in both combat and strategy? Did her status reflect not just military might, but religious or symbolic authority, perhaps linked to Norse beliefs about fate, prophecy, and the divine feminine? Such theories remain in the realm of conjecture, but they reflect the compelling mystery at the heart of this burial. The bones in grave BJ 581 are silent now, but they speak in the language of steel and ritual. They hint at a life lived not in the shadows, but on the front lines. A woman who, centuries before modern notions of equality, stood among warriors not as an outlier, but perhaps as a leader. Her name is lost. Her victories, if any, unrecorded. But her presence endures, challenging our assumptions, reshaping our understanding of the Viking world. She lies among the grass-covered mounds of Birka, her weapons rusted, her horses long decayed. But her story, now, only just beginning to emerge. Was she one of many? Or was she the only one? And how many more graves wait, undisturbed, holding truths we have yet to unearth? Truths that may one day rewrite not only Viking history, but our understanding of the past itself. High above the North Atlantic, the sky turns silver gray. The sun vanishes behind a veil of cloud, and the horizon dissolves into mist. Beneath the vast silence, a Viking longship cuts through icy water, its square sail taut against the wind, its crew scanning the sky. There are no compasses, no charts, only instinct. And something else. A small object held aloft, smooth, translucent, almost glowing. A crystal. Could it be that the Vikings, centuries before the invention of the magnetic compass, used a natural lens, a fragment of the Earth's geometry, to read the sky even when the sun was invisible? This is the mystery of the so-called Sunstone, and at the heart of it lies a deeper enigma. Were Viking navigators harnessing the polarizing power of light, centuries ahead of modern optics? And if so, what exactly were these tools? How were they used? And how much have we forgotten? The idea first surfaced in the Icelandic Sagas, where the concept of a sunstone is mentioned, briefly, almost casually. In Rudolf's Thottir, a tale written down in the 13th century, King Olaf of Norway uses a sunstone to determine the sun's position on a cloudy day. No great fanfare, no explanation, just a matter-of-fact reference, as though it were common knowledge. But what was this stone? And how could it reveal the sun? For centuries, scholars dismissed the mention as allegorical or literary flourish. Then, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, scientists began to take the question seriously. The key lay in a natural phenomenon known as polarization. When sunlight passes through the atmosphere, it becomes polarized. Its waves align in specific directions. While invisible to the naked eye, this polarized light can be detected using certain materials. Among them is Iceland spar, a clear form of calcite crystal, abundant in Iceland and known for its optical properties. Iceland spar exhibits a characteristic known as birefringence. It splits incoming light into two rays, each traveling at a slightly different angle. When the stone is rotated against the sky, the brightness of these rays shifts. By finding the angle where the two images appear equally bright, one can infer the position of the sun, even behind cloud cover or after sunset. Could this be the sunstone? Experiments in recent decades suggest that, with training, a navigator could use such a crystal to locate the sun's position with impressive accuracy, often within a few degrees. A remarkable feat for an age without sextants, compasses, or modern instruments. But here's where the mystery deepens. No sunstone has ever been conclusively identified from an authenticated Viking archaeological site. The sagas mention them. The physics makes sense, but the physical evidence is elusive. Then came an unexpected discovery. In 2002, archaeologists studying the Alderney shipwreck, a 16th century English vessel found near the Channel Islands, uncovered a calcite crystal, remarkably well preserved, lying near navigational tools. Though centuries after the Viking Age, this find suggested that the technique may have persisted quietly into later periods of exploration. Had the knowledge been passed down, undocumented? Was it once more widespread than we've assumed? Some scholars now argue that sunstones may have been among the personal possessions of Viking navigators, used by a small, specialized elite, and never widely adopted or ritually buried. Such tools, crafted from organic material like leather and wood and paired with the crystal, could easily decay over time, leaving little trace. Others propose that the stones were considered sacred or secretive, kept within families or guilds, their use cloaked in oral tradition rather than recorded lore. There are also theories that extend further into speculation. Some researchers have explored whether Vikings combined the sunstone with other navigational aids, such as wooden sun compasses or shadow boards, to refine their readings. A controversial wooden artifact discovered in Greenland and dubbed a sun compass features a series of engraved arcs and notches. Though interpretations vary, one hypothesis suggests it could track the shadow of the sun at different latitudes and times of year, functioning as a primitive but effective guide. Used in tandem with a crystal, this could have allowed Norse sailors to maintain remarkably accurate east-west courses, even during long transatlantic crossings where cloud and fog rendered the sun invisible for days. Still, the sunstone remains frustratingly absent from the archaeological record. No Viking ship burial has yielded such a crystal. No Norse text explains its use. No workshop, no diagram, no definitive physical clue, so we're left with tantalizing fragments. A saga, a science, a shipwreck centuries removed, a stone with unique properties, and a culture whose navigational prowess defied what we thought was possible. Were sunstones truly used aboard Viking ships? Or are we projecting modern understanding onto fragments of myth? Could the sagas have preserved not just tales of gods and kings, but practical, technical knowledge passed down across generations, hidden in plain sight? And if sunstones were used, how far could they have taken the Norse? To Greenland? To Vinland? To lands yet undiscovered? We may never know the full extent of their journeys or the tools that guided them, but the possibility lingers like mist over the ocean, that deep within their understanding of nature, the Vikings held a secret, one that harnessed the unseen, that read light where none could be seen, that turned stone into compass, and somewhere perhaps beneath a mound, within a buried ship or lost in the silt of a forgotten fjord, lies a crystal still waiting to tell its story. In the stillness of a Norwegian morning, where low fog creeps across emerald fields and birch trees rustle faintly in the wind, there lies a place where the past once stirred to life in dramatic silence. Tucked near the banks of the Oslo fjord, beneath a modest mound of earth, lay one of the most extraordinary archaeological finds of the Viking Age, a grave unlike any other. It was 1904 when farmers in Vestfold unearthed something strange, the prow of a ship, carved with elegant spirals and coiled beasts, breaking through the soil like a memory surfacing from deep time. What emerged over the following months astonished even seasoned archaeologists. 70 feet long, sleek and narrow, the Oseberg ship was a masterpiece of Norse craftsmanship. Constructed around 820 AD, its lines were both functional and beautiful, built to cut through water with speed and grace, yet adorned with intricate carvings that danced along the oak planks. Dragons and serpents, interlocking patterns, and flowing ornamentation transformed the vessel into a floating work of art. But this ship was never meant to sail again. It had been buried deep in a clay-rich mound, carefully placed, sealed away from air and light, with 2 human skeletons laid within, surrounded by an astonishing array of grave goods, woven tapestries, intricately carved wooden sledges, animal remains, domestic tools, and delicate textiles that once shimmered with color. This was no warrior's burial. It was something else entirely. From the beginning, the Oseberg find puzzled researchers. The grandeur of the burial indicated immense wealth and status, but it was not a man who lay in state at the heart of the ship. It was 2 women, one aged around 80, suffering from arthritis and possibly cancer. The other, younger, perhaps in her 50s, healthier but no less enigmatic. Who were they? Royalty? Priestesses? The elder may have been a queen or noblewoman. Some speculate she was Queen Osa of the Yngling dynasty, though no inscription confirms this. The younger woman's identity is even more obscure. A servant? A relative? Or something more symbolic? Their clothing, what little survived, was luxurious, suggesting elite status. But it was the burial itself that invited deeper questions. Unlike the stereotypical Viking grave of weapons and shields, this was a world of ritual, symbolism, and ceremony. The Oseberg burial is rich with hints of a spiritual role, perhaps even a religious office. Among the most striking items were the ornately carved sleighs, functional yes, but also ceremonial in design. Animals were laid to rest nearby, including horses and oxen, their deaths part of a complex funerary ritual. A richly decorated cart bore the hallmarks of symbolic use, not everyday transport. And woven tapestries, fragmented but still vibrant, depicted what some believed to be processions, rituals, and mythological scenes. Gods? Ancestors? Rites of passage? What kind of Viking funeral was this? Many scholars now consider the possibility that at least one of the women buried here held a spiritual role, perhaps a Völva, a seeress or priestess within Norse pagan society. In sagas and Eddic poetry, Völvas were women of vision, ritual, and power, called upon to interpret the will of the gods, to bless or curse, to guide kings, and shape destiny. Could this burial be the resting place of such a figure? If so, it suggests a more complex and nuanced view of Viking belief systems, one in which women could wield spiritual authority and receive funerary honors as elaborate as any warrior. Yet the lines between historical fact and symbolic narrative remain blurred. What exactly was the purpose of the carved animals that flanked the ship? Were they purely decorative or totemic? Symbols meant to guard or guide the souls of the dead. And what of the unknown wooden artifacts found within? Complex shapes, tools, and carvings whose purpose remains unclear? Were they ceremonial items, used in rites we no longer understand? or remnants of a belief system lost to time. There are stranger theories too. Some propose that the burial was staged, its contents deliberately symbolic, its intent more theatrical than functional. The women may not have died together. Perhaps one was interred later, added to complete a ritual cycle. Others have suggested the burial was never completed, that grave robbers disturbed it before the mound was sealed, or that something halted the funeral's final rites. The skeletal remains show signs of prior disturbance, their placement unusual, their completeness uncertain. Even the ship itself raises questions. Its structure is more refined than most known warships or trading vessels. Was it built specifically for burial or repurposed? And what of its design? Does it reflect a regional shipbuilding tradition or something more singular, reserved for elite rites? In more speculative corners, whispers emerge of secret rites and lost religions. Could the Oseberg burial be a rare window into pre-Christian Nordic cosmology? Was this ship intended to carry the dead across spiritual waters, to the halls of Freyja, or perhaps to an older, unnamed afterlife? The myths of the Vikings speak of ships that sail not only through sea, but through worlds, across the sky, into darkness, and beyond death. So what was the Oseberg ship? A queen's tomb? A priestess's portal? A ceremonial monument to a forgotten goddess? No definitive answer has emerged. But the beauty and mystery of the burial remain undiminished. The wood, restored and displayed today in Oslo's Viking Ship Museum, still carries the echoes of the past. The carvings still shimmer with quiet meaning. The silence of the grave is full of questions. Who were the women buried there? What rituals surrounded their death? And what deeper truths might still lie beneath the earth waiting to be unearthed in some future season of discovery? The Oseberg burial offers no easy answers, only shadows, symbols, and the distant sound of a ship resting forever on land, its voyage, real or spiritual, forever unknown. In the heart of southern Sweden, surrounded by fields of golden wheat and quiet pine forests, a single block of stone rises from the earth. Weather-worn and lichen-streaked, it stands just over 8 feet tall, an ancient monument tucked beside a modest churchyard in the village of Rhode. To the untrained eye, it might pass unnoticed, but upon its rough surface is carved something extraordinary. Over 700 runes, etched in orderly lines, cover both faces of the stone. They twist around its edges and spill onto its flanks, unfolding like a cryptic labyrinth of language. This is the Rhode runestone, one of the most famous and perplexing runic inscriptions ever discovered. Dated to around the early 9th century, the stone contains what is believed to be the longest surviving runic text from the Viking Age, and yet, no one truly knows what it says. At first glance, the stone's message appears to be a tribute, a memorial from a grieving father to his deceased son. That's how the inscription begins, at least. But quickly, the text veers into riddles, allusions, and mythic references that have baffled scholars for generations. Why would a memorial mix personal grief with cryptic messages about forgotten battles and shadowy gods? Who was meant to understand these words? And more curiously, what might be hidden between the lines? The Rhode stone's creator, known only as Varin, dedicated the monument to his son Vaemod, whose fate remains unclear. But rather than recount Vaemod's deeds plainly, the text slips into obscurity. It references the 20 kings who sat on a battlefield, an event unrecorded in other sources. It mentions Theodoric the Bold, likely the Ostrogothic king who ruled from Ravenna in the 5th century, seemingly out of historical sequence. It invokes ancient forces of darkness, loss, and vengeance. Some parts of the inscription seem to be encoded in riddles. Others switch between different runic alphabets, possibly to confuse or impress the reader. Was this simply poetic license, or something more purposeful? Deciphering the rook stone has become a puzzle without end. Early interpretations saw the text as a mythical narrative, a tale of gods and heroes from Norse cosmology, designed to honor the fallen sun by situating his death within a larger epic. Others have seen it as a record of real historical battles, now forgotten. Still others suggest it served a political or ceremonial purpose, reinforcing lineage or sacred duty in a way lost to modern understanding. But, in recent years, new theories have emerged, adding layers to an already complex mystery. In 2020, a group of Swedish scholars proposed that the Ruk runestone was written in the aftermath of a climate catastrophe, the volcanic eruption of 536 AD, followed by years of darkness, famine, and societal upheaval. According to their interpretation, the stone is a meditation on loss and fear, an attempt to make sense of a world that had, not long before, been plunged into chaos. Is it possible that Varin, haunted by the death of his son, encoded his grief not just in personal sorrow, but in cosmic terms? A blending of individual and cultural memory. Could the twilight of the gods he referenced be more metaphorical than mythological? A reflection of an existential crisis passed down through oral tradition? If so, the Ruk stone becomes not only a monument to one life, but a philosophical reflection on death, destruction, and the impermanence of order. And yet, even that reading cannot explain every riddle etched into its surface. Why does the text shift in tone, form, and even alphabet? Is it hiding something? Perhaps a secret message known only to a few? Could it be a code, a layered form of memory, designed to preserve knowledge in a world where writing was rare and power passed through the spoken word? Fringe theorists have proposed even stranger possibilities. Some suggest the Ruk stone was part of an esoteric tradition, an object designed to train elite poets or ritual leaders, perhaps a kind of mnemonic device for keeping ancient myths alive. Others have speculated that it holds astronomical significance, with certain lines referring to eclipses, solstices, or the motions of celestial bodies. Still others believe the stone encodes political warnings or prophecies, dire statements about a coming age of disorder, masked in allegory. Of course, none of these theories are proven, but the text itself, dense, difficult, and richly elusive, offers no easy answers. And maybe that was the point. In a world where much was transmitted through memory and song, the Ruk stone may have been designed not to explain, but to provoke. A riddle, yes, but also a mirror, reflecting back the concerns, fears, and values of a people standing between eras, between the old pagan world and the growing influence of Christianity, between oral tradition and written record, between memory and myth. Even its physical form suggests permanence, but also imperfection. Weather has worn parts of the inscription, lines are missing, others are debated endlessly due to ambiguous characters or unusual phrasing. What we read today may be only a partial echo of the original message, a fragment of a once coherent voice now scattered by time. And so the Ruk runestone remains a paradox. It speaks across centuries, yet it resists clear understanding. It preserves one man's grief, but wraps it in riddles. It may offer a glimpse into Norse cosmology, Viking politics, ancient catastrophes, or none of these at all. Who was Varin? What did he truly want us to remember? And how much of the Viking world remains hidden in symbols we no longer know how to read? The stone stands still in Ruk, silent in the wind, its surface carved with the weight of centuries. Visitors come and stare. Scholars translate and argue. But the message, its true message, remains locked behind time, waiting. In the rolling countryside of western Minnesota, far from the fjords and forests of Scandinavia, there stands a slab of gray stone, heavy, weathered, and inscribed with strange runes. It rests quietly inside a small museum in the town of Alexandria, its surface etched with a message that has ignited debate for over a century. This is the Kensington Runestone. Discovered in 1898 by a Swedish-American farmer named Olof Öhman while clearing trees from his land, the 200-pound stone was found tangled in the roots of a poplar. Öhman claimed he had no idea what it was, just that it bore markings unlike anything he'd ever seen. What he had uncovered, he believed, was a relic of ancient history. The inscription, written in runes and partial Old Swedish, tells a startling tale. According to the carved message, a group of Norse explorers, 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians, journeyed deep into the interior of North America in the year 1362. Their party, it claims, camped near the lake and returned from a fishing expedition to find 10 of their number dead, red with blood and dead. The remaining men, fearing attack, carved the stone to mark the tragedy and their presence before continuing their journey. If true, it would rewrite history. The idea that Vikings reached not just the Canadian coast, as accepted through the discovery of Lons Meadows, but ventured nearly 1,000 miles inland through riverways and across the Great Plains, centuries before Columbus, is staggering. But the moment the stone was made public, the controversy began. Linguists, historians, archaeologists, and amateur sleuths all weighed in, some with fascination, others with deep skepticism. Was the stone a genuine Norse artifact or a clever hoax? Critics were quick to point out that the language on the stone seemed anachronistic. The runes, while mostly consistent with medieval alphabets, contained forms not known to exist in the 14th century. The phrasing resembled modern Swedish more than Old Norse. And most damning of all, the stone's grammar and vocabulary seemed suspiciously close to the dialect spoken by Scandinavian immigrants living in Minnesota at the time of the discovery. Some accused Öhman himself of forging the stone, perhaps as a prank, or as a misguided attempt to connect his heritage to the new world in which he now lived. Öhman always denied these claims, and no conclusive evidence has ever proven him guilty of fabrication. And yet, the skepticism persisted. The scientific establishment largely dismissed the Kensington Runestone as a 19th century forgery, a product of pride, nationalism, or simple mischief. For many decades, it was treated as a curiosity, a regional legend more than a serious historical artifact. But others weren't so quick to let it go. Supporters of the stone's authenticity have pointed out that the geography described on the inscription, such as references to waterways and positioning one day's journey north from this stone, lines up reasonably well with local terrain and known canoe routes. Could a Norse expedition, traveling from Hudson Bay or the Great Lakes, have made it this far? It's not impossible. Waterways were the highways of pre-modern North America. Moreover, some defenders argue that the so-called linguistic errors may not be errors at all, but rather dialectical quirks or a result of language evolving through oral tradition in remote communities. After all, Scandinavian explorers in 1362 would likely not have been using pristine Book Old Norse. They would have spoken a living language, perhaps influenced by contact with others, or passed through generations of informal instruction. And the runes? Some scholars suggest that hybrid or transitional forms of characters could have existed and simply failed to survive in other manuscripts. In the last few decades, renewed interest has brought new energy to the debate. Geologists have examined the weathering of the inscription, attempting to determine whether the grooves in the stone could plausibly be over 600 years old. Their conclusions vary. Some say the marks seem too fresh. Others argue that, given the stone's time buried under a tree and protected from elements, its preservation doesn't rule out great age. In 2003, a team led by runologist Richard Nielsen and engineer Richard Skoglund conducted a detailed analysis and argued that the rune forms and syntax were consistent with medieval Scandinavian usage. Though not universally accepted, their findings added fuel to the idea that the stone deserves a second look. There are even more fringe theories, proposals that the stone was left by members of a lost Norse colony, or part of an extended secret mission into the North American interior, hidden from mainstream history. Others suggest that the stone, real or not, may encode layers of meaning, messages not meant for modern readers but for descendants, or for those with the cultural key to unlock it. So where does that leave us? The Kensington runestone remains an enigma. It lies at the intersection of archaeology, folklore, identity, and national myth. Dismissed by many, embraced by others, it endures, carved in stone, both literally and symbolically. Its message is simple, even tragic. A brief record of loss and fear, of exploration and survival. But is it the voice of a 14th century Norse traveler, writing far from home, or the invention of a 19th century immigrant, yearning to place his heritage on American soil? Is it a hoax, or a forgotten chapter of history, hiding in plain sight? Perhaps the greatest mystery of the Kensington runestone is not just what it says, but how it continues to speak, more than a century after it was pulled from the roots of a Minnesota tree. And if it is real, if even part of it is grounded in truth, what other traces might still be buried in the heartland of North America, waiting for their stories to be uncovered? In the quiet stillness of a Scandinavian fjord, as the mist drifts over pine-covered hills and the waves lap gently at the shore, a solitary figure stands beneath a vast gray sky. Her staff is carved with runes. Draped in woven robes dyed with deep indigo and ochre, she gazes into the unseen. To the people of her time, she is no ordinary woman. She is a Völva, a seeress, a wise woman, a traveler between worlds. The presence of the Völva in Viking Age society opens a door into one of the most enigmatic corners of Norse history. Neither warrior nor ruler, she nevertheless commanded deep respect. Her role was spiritual, her power mysterious, her knowledge feared and revered. But what exactly did she do? Who were these women who wielded such influence? And how much of their story has been lost to time? The word Völva translates roughly to wand-bearer, a reference to the ritual staff she often carried. In sagas and poetic texts, the Völva is depicted as a figure of arcane wisdom, capable of foretelling the future, communing with spirits, and shaping fate through song and spell. She is not just a soothsayer, but a conduit between the human world and the unseen forces that govern it. One of the most vivid descriptions comes from the saga of Eric the Red. There, a Völva arrives at a remote Icelandic settlement, richly dressed and seated high above the others during a ritual meal. She speaks with confidence and detail about the fortunes of the coming season, answering questions posed by those gathered. Her words are taken as truth. No one challenges her authority. This portrayal, while literary, is supported by archaeological finds, graves that contain what appear to be the remains of Seeresses. Among them is the remarkable burial at Birka in Denmark, where a woman was laid to rest with a long iron staff, glass beads, herbs, and other items interpreted as ritual tools. At Oseberg in Norway, possibly the most elaborate female burial of the Viking Age, one of the two women may have been a Völva as well, based on similar grave goods and the ceremonial nature of the interment. But what exactly was the role of these women? Did they serve as priestesses, healers, witches, or all three? The sagas and Eddic poems blur the lines between myth and memory. In Völuspa, one of the foundational poems of Norse cosmology, a Völva speaks directly to Odin, recounting the creation of the world and foretelling its end at Ragnarok. She is not a passive observer. She is the narrator of cosmic time. Was this poetic convention, or a reflection of real beliefs, where women could hold sacred authority and challenge even the gods. Some scholars believe the Völva may have practiced Seaidr, a form of Norse magic associated with prophecy, trance, and fate manipulation. Seaidr was considered powerful but also dangerous, and those who practiced it walked a thin line between reverence and suspicion. The god Odin is said to have mastered it, though doing so challenged traditional gender norms of the time. Freyja, the Vanir goddess, is described as its first teacher. This association with femininity, fate, and liminality places the Völva in a unique space. She is neither entirely within society nor outside of it. She lives on the edge, sometimes traveling between communities, summoned for counsel, other times feared or ostracized when her knowledge becomes too unsettling. Her tools were likely symbolic as well as practical. The staff, often iron-tipped, may have served as a wand, a ritual instrument, or a representation of authority. She carried pouches of herbs, beads, perhaps amulets. She sang or chanted in Galdr, ritual incantations meant to open doors between the worlds. In some reconstructions, she entered trance states to access knowledge beyond ordinary perception. But how much of this is real? And how much is reconstructed from myth and fragments? No complete Norse magical manual has survived. Much of what we know, or think we know, about the Völva comes from Christian-era texts written long after the fall of the old gods. How accurately do they portray the role of the Seeresses? Were they romanticizing the past or demonizing it? More fringe theories suggest the Völva was part of a hidden cult or matriarchal priesthood, preserving ancient Indo-European traditions that predate the Viking Age itself. Others propose that she was the custodian of tribal memory, keeping history and law through oral recitation, passing on secret knowledge to chosen successors. Some even speculate that the Völva's practices may have involved psychoactive substances, mushrooms or herbal mixtures used to induce visions. Though no direct evidence supports this, the idea continues to surface in modern interpretations of shamanic traditions. So who was the Völva? Was she a prophetess, a healer, a shaman, or simply a woman who dared to speak the truths others feared? We may never know the full extent of her role or influence, but in the sagas, the graves, and the scattered remnants of lore, she still stands, wrapped in wool and mystery, her eyes fixed on something beyond the veil. And as we listen closely to the wind over the fjords, we might ask, what else did she know? What visions were never written down, and how much wisdom, spoken softly around ancient fires, still lingers in the shadows, waiting to be rediscovered? Beneath the dark clouds that roll over the rugged coastlines of Scandinavia, where the cold sea crashes against jagged stone and pine forests whisper in the wind, a chill lingers not only in the air, but in the imagination. It is here, in the heart of Norse lands, that one of the most disturbing and debated rituals of the Viking Age takes form. A ritual so brutal, so theatrical in its horror that it blurs the line between history and myth. It is called the Blood Eagle. According to sagas and medieval chronicles, the ritual unfolded in grim fashion. A victim, often a captured noble or traitor, was laid prone, his ribs carefully severed from the spine with deliberate cuts. The ribs were then spread outward like wings, and the lungs were pulled from the body to hang exposed, flaring red and wet in the open air. The imagery was unmistakable, the shape of an eagle carved from living flesh. But did this ritual truly happen? Or was it the invention of later storytellers, meant to terrify, impress, or symbolize something deeper? The earliest references to the blood eagle come not from contemporary Viking sources, but from later medieval texts, many written by Christian monks who viewed the Norsemen as savage heathens. Chief among these accounts is the Orkneyinga saga, composed in the 13th century, which claims that the Norwegian warrior Torf Einar performed the rite on Halfdan Longleg, son of King Harald Fairhair. The tale is graphic and solemn, describing how Einar avenged his father's death through this gruesome execution. Later sagas, including the tale of Ragnar's sons, describe the same punishment being enacted on King Ella of Northumbria after he killed the legendary Viking Ragnar Lothbrok. In these accounts, Ragnar's sons, particularly Ivar the Boneless, exact retribution by performing the blood eagle on Illa, slicing him open and offering his life to Odin. These stories are vivid, disturbing, but they are also written centuries after the events they describe, and that leaves a critical question hanging in the air. Were these rituals real events, or literary devices, exaggerated through generations of oral tradition and cultural bias? Some scholars argue that the blood eagle was never truly performed, that it is a misinterpretation of poetic kennings and stylized descriptions found in Norse verse. The skaldic poetry of the Viking Age often used metaphor and symbolic language to describe death in battle or ritual sacrifice. Phrases like eagle's feast or spreading the wings may have referred not to literal evisceration, but to the feeding of carrion birds on fallen enemies. Over time, these metaphors could have been taken at face value by later authors unfamiliar with the subtleties of Viking poetry. Others suggest that Christian chroniclers had a vested interest in portraying pagan rituals as monstrous. By emphasizing cruelty and barbarism, they could contrast their own faith's civility and divine order with the supposed chaos of the Norse. In this view, the blood eagle may be a kind of cultural propaganda, a literary tool used to demonize a vanquished people. But the evidence isn't entirely one-sided. Archaeological findings, while inconclusive, offer curious hints. Some Viking-era skeletal remains exhibit cut marks along the ribs and vertebrae that are difficult to explain through known combat injuries. These patterns don't prove the blood eagle was performed, but they don't rule it out either. Could they be the traces of ritualized execution, or simply signs of post-mortem mutilation in the heat of revenge or warfare? The ritual's supposed purpose also raises questions. If the blood eagle did occur, it would not have been casual cruelty. It would have been a statement, an act of spiritual significance, or a declaration of vengeance and power. Some interpretations suggest the blood eagle was a form of sacrifice to Odin, the god of war and death, who hung himself on Yggdrasil, the world tree, and gave one of his eyes in exchange for wisdom. In that cosmology, death through suffering could be a path to transcendence, or, in the case of enemies, a way to dishonor their soul. Perhaps the blood eagle was meant to sever a traitor from Valhalla, denying them glory in the afterlife. But even if we accept that, the logistical question remains: could such a procedure have been performed with the tools available at the time? Some anatomists and historians suggest that it would have been nearly impossible to carry out the blood eagle as described without the victim dying almost instantly. The human body is not so easily transformed. The lungs, once exposed, would collapse. The blood loss would be overwhelming. Unless the ritual didn't require the victim to survive. Perhaps the horror lay not in prolonging the death, but in the spectacle, the symbolism. A dramatic dismemberment, performed after death or near death, meant to terrify enemies and glorify the victors. The wings were not meant to fly, they were meant to be seen. Even among Viking audiences, such a ritual, if it existed, would have been extraordinary. There is no evidence that the blood eagle was commonplace. It appears only in rare, specific narratives, often connected to vengeance, divine judgment, or betrayal. Was it a memory of a single act, retold and reshaped over time? Or a dark fiction crafted to reflect cultural values, even if it never truly happened? The mystery of the blood eagle continues to fascinate not only because of its brutality, but because of its ambiguity. Did the Vikings truly perform this ritual? Or did later storytellers, centuries removed from the world they described, carve their own myth into the stone of history? In the end, the Blood Eagle is not just a question of flesh and bone. It is a question of story, of how we understand violence, justice, and the line between reality and legend. It lingers in the sagas, in the bones of ancient kings, and in the silence of northern lands, where the past sleeps beneath layers of ice and moss. And we are left to wonder, was the eagle ever truly carved? Or has it only ever flown in the imagination? Tucked away in the leafy heart of Turo Park in Newport, Rhode Island, stands a stone structure that seems at once out of place and out of time. Weathered by centuries of wind and salt air, it rises quietly among the trees, 8 round columns forming a circular tower, connected by arches of rough-hewn stone. It is roofless, silent, and without inscription. To the casual visitor, it might seem like a forgotten colonial ruin, but to others it's something far more provocative, a potential link between Viking explorers and the early history of North America. A monument, perhaps, to a forgotten Norse presence on the eastern seaboard, centuries before Columbus ever glimpsed these shores. Known simply as the Newport Tower, or sometimes the Old Stone Mill, this curious edifice has stood at the center of one of America's most enduring historical mysteries. Who built it? When? And why? The mainstream explanation is relatively straightforward. Most historians attribute the tower's construction to the mid-17th century, likely commissioned by Benedict Arnold, not the infamous traitor of the Revolutionary War, but his great-grandfather, a prominent early governor of Rhode Island. Records from the late 1600s refer to Arnold's stone-built windmill, and stylistic comparisons have been made to similar mills found in England. The argument is logical. The structure could indeed have functioned as a windmill, and its materials and mortar appear consistent with colonial techniques of the time. For many, this explanation closes the case, and yet the tower refuses to settle into historical certainty. Why? Because the building doesn't quite behave like a colonial windmill. It lacks certain typical features, no clear evidence of wooden framing to support sails, no definitive signs of grinding mechanisms. Its round, Romanesque arches more closely resemble medieval European architecture than the purely utilitarian design of early American mills. This architectural ambiguity has opened the door to a far more tantalizing theory, that the Newport Tower predates English settlement entirely and may have been built by Norse explorers, possibly the same Vikings credited with reaching Newfoundland at Meadows around the year 1000. The theory isn't new. In the 19th century, as interest in Viking history surged, writers and amateur historians began to propose that Leif Erikson or his successors had sailed much farther south than previously believed, down the coast of Nova Scotia, past Cape Cod and into Narragansett Bay. Some speculated that the tower was part of a Norse settlement, perhaps even the elusive Vinland mentioned in the medieval sagas. This interpretation was further fueled by the efforts of Danish antiquarian Carl Christian Raffen, who, in 1837, published a detailed study arguing that the tower's dimensions, orientation, and features matched those of early Christian churches built by Norse settlers in Greenland and Iceland. He noted, for instance, that the tower's windows may have been positioned to align with solstices or cardinal points, characteristics found in Scandinavian ecclesiastical architecture. But such claims, while fascinating, face stiff scrutiny. Modern archaeological methods have attempted to date the mortar and materials of the tower. Some studies have supported the 17th century construction theory, citing lime-based mortar consistent with colonial techniques. Yet others claim that elements of the structure, such as the stone selection and layout, suggest an earlier origin. Even more speculative theories have emerged over time. Some fringe researchers propose that the tower was part of a Templar outpost built by medieval knights fleeing persecution in Europe. Others suggest that pre-Columbian transoceanic contact between Europeans and Native Americans may have been far more widespread than accepted narratives admit. Yet despite all these theories, mainstream and fringe alike, one thing remains constant. The Newport Tower does not entirely yield its secrets. Attempts to trace its history through documentary records run into frustrating gaps. The earliest known reference comes from Governor Arnold's will in 1677, describing "my stone-built windmill." But that phrase alone does not confirm the mill was built by him, only that it existed and was under his ownership at the time. Could he have acquired an older structure and repurposed it? Or is the simplest explanation the correct one, that it was newly built in his lifetime? The surrounding region offers few clues. While Norse artifacts have been found in parts of North America, notably in Newfoundland, no confirmed Viking relics have ever been discovered in Rhode Island. No runestones, no tools, no burials, nothing, that is, to anchor the tower to a definitive Norse presence. And yet, the silence itself is part of the mystery. What if this is precisely the kind of footprint a brief exploratory Norse voyage might leave behind? A single structure, a short-lived settlement, a moment in time, quickly abandoned and slowly absorbed by the land. There's also the question of memory. Indigenous oral traditions in the region speak of strange visitors from across the sea, tall, pale-skinned, with unusual boats and clothing. Are these echoes of Viking contact, or merely the result of post-contact reinterpretations? Ultimately, the mystery of the Newport Tower lives in its refusal to confirm any singular narrative. It sits at the crossroads of possibility and doubt, a physical relic that could be either ordinary or extraordinary. The stones are silent, but their shape stirs questions that have never quite faded. Could a Viking expedition have left its mark in the very heart of colonial New England? Or is this story, like so many tied to the Norse, the product of layered myth, misinterpretation, and yearning for a deeper connection to a forgotten past? The tower still stands, weathered, enigmatic, and unyielding. And as the light shifts through its arches, casting shadows on the grass below, one can't help but wonder, is this the work of a colonial millwright, or the last surviving trace of a voyage lost to history? Amid the windswept plains of Zealand, Denmark, a near-perfect circle rises from the earth, a ring of grassy mounds and faint ditches, now softened by time but unmistakably deliberate. From the sky, it resembles a great wheel stamped into the landscape, its radiating roads converging at a central hub. This is Trelleborg, one of the most iconic and enigmatic of the Viking ring forts. Its symmetry is arresting, its design exacting, and its purpose still uncertain. Built more than 1,000 years ago, Trelleborg and its sister forts, Agersborg, Fyrkat, Nonnebakken, and others, share an almost mathematical precision. Circular ramparts, 4 cardinal gates, intersecting timber roads forming a cross within the circle. The structures housed longhouses placed in quadrants, suggesting order, planning, and a centralized authority. But what was this authority seeking to achieve? Historians generally agree that these ring forts date to the reign of King Harald Bluetooth in the late 10th century, during a time of dramatic consolidation in Viking Denmark. Bluetooth, credited with unifying the Danes and promoting Christianity, left behind these monuments as part of a broader transformation of Norse society, from scattered tribal rule to a centralized kingdom. The precision of the ring forts suggests state-level control over labor and resources. Their construction would have required thousands of workers, careful engineering, and access to timber and stone on a vast scale. Radiocarbon dating places their use squarely within a narrow window, somewhere between 975 and 980 AD. And yet, what makes the Trelleborg forts truly mysterious is not just their construction, but their fleeting use. Archaeological evidence suggests many were abandoned within a generation, some even before they were fully completed. Why would a king invest in such monumental works, only for them to fade so quickly from relevance? The mainstream interpretation posits that these ring forts served as military garrisons, strongholds for royal troops during a period of internal consolidation and external threat. Their strategic locations, often near rivers or coastlines, suggest they could mobilize soldiers quickly and exert control over surrounding territories. Some, like Aggersborg, could house several hundred warriors and their families. But if they were military installations, why the perfect geometry? Why the repeated circular design across multiple sites? Why the emphasis on symmetry and form? Some historians propose that the layout served both practical and symbolic purposes. The circular form may have signified cosmic order or divine favor, an expression of the king's authority not only over land and people, but over the very order of the world. In a time of religious transition, the forts may have acted as both fortresses and ideological statements, showcasing power, unity, and perhaps even a fusion of Old Norse cosmology with emerging Christian ideals. Others suggest a more administrative function. Could these have been regional centers for taxation, governance, or trade? Their internal organization, longhouses arranged with clear planning, resembles the structured layouts of later monastic or urban centers. Perhaps Trelleborg and its siblings were early experiments in centralized governance, proto-cities or way stations on a kingdom-wide network. There's also the possibility of ritual or ceremonial use. While no temples or shrines have been definitively identified within the forts, the sheer precision and repetition of the design hints at a symbolic dimension. Did the ring represent something sacred? A cosmological model? A liminal space between the earthly and the divine? Then there are the outlier theories. Some fringe interpretations suggest the Trelleborg forts were far older than Harald Bluetooth, built atop ancient sacred sites, or even remnants of a forgotten pre-Viking civilization. While lacking archaeological support, these ideas persist in certain circles, inspired by the mystery of the design and the suddenness of their construction and abandonment. Others speculate about astronomical alignments, claiming the gates of certain forts may align with solstice sunrises or lunar events. While not widely accepted in academic circles, the idea adds yet another layer of intrigue to structures already loaded with unanswered questions. Perhaps the most curious feature of all is how short-lived the forts were. Excavations at Birka and Trelleborg show evidence of burning, abandonment, and decline within just a few decades, if not years, of their construction. Some have theorized that internal rebellion, shifting power dynamics, or external invasions rendered them obsolete. Others suggest that their purpose was always temporary, built for a singular campaign, then left behind when their role had been fulfilled. Strikingly, similar circular fortresses do not appear again in Viking architecture. The style is unique to this brief moment in Danish history. What inspired it? And why was it never repeated? Each ring fort offers its own subtle variations, different sizes, slightly different constructions, yet they all adhere to the same basic blueprint, a blueprint whose origin remains obscure. Was it inspired by foreign influences, Roman forts, Celtic enclosures, or was it a uniquely Scandinavian innovation? Today, visitors to Trelleborg walk among reconstructed longhouses, their timbers dark against the open sky. They trace the arc of the ramparts, peer through gates that once led to hearths, warriors, and commands. The wind whispers over the grass, and the silence of centuries presses down. And as we stand within the perfect circle, gazing at the symmetry carved into the earth, one question lingers. What story was this place trying to tell? Was it a stronghold, a symbol, a sanctuary? Or something else entirely, forgotten beneath the soil, waiting to be unearthed by future minds willing to listen to the silence? Somewhere beneath the dense forests of eastern Canada, or perhaps buried along a forgotten riverbank in Maine or the shadowed edges of a Midwestern valley, lies the potential key to one of the most compelling mysteries of early exploration: the fate of the lost Norse colony in North America. The story begins where the wind is cold and the sea is harder still, at the very edge of the known medieval world. Lanceau's Meadows, the windswept coastal site in Newfoundland, is today recognized as the only confirmed Norse settlement in North America. Discovered in the 1960s, this UNESCO World Heritage Site offers proof that Viking explorers crossed the Atlantic and built a small, functioning outpost on the New World's rocky shores around 1000 AD. But Lanceau Meadows, with its modest cluster of turf buildings, is clearly not the entire story. What happened next? Did the Norse merely touch the coast and retreat? Or did they venture deeper into the continent, establishing for a time a more ambitious colony that has since vanished from both the landscape and the historical record? The Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, two semi-mythical Icelandic texts written down centuries after the events they describe, speak of a land called Vinland, a place where the sun shone warmer, the forests were thick, and wild grapes grew freely. According to these accounts, Leif Erikson and others not only reached these shores, but attempted to settle them. The sagas describe conflicts with the indigenous inhabitants, long voyages inland, and the births of Norse children on American soil. But where precisely was Vinland? And what became of those who lived there? For generations, historians and archaeologists have scoured the Atlantic seaboard in search of answers. Some believe Vinland refers solely to Newfoundland and surrounding areas. Others argue the descriptions in the sagas point to regions further south, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, or even as far as the Gulf of St. Lawrence. A few more radical theories place Vinland in New England, or even the shores of the Great Lakes. There are clues, but none are conclusive. In 1898, a farmer in Minnesota unearthed the now famous Kensington runestone, a carved slab bearing runic inscriptions that claim to document a Norse expedition deep into the American interior in the 14th century. While most scholars consider the stone a hoax, its mysterious language and setting have fueled speculation for decades. Could it represent a memory, however distorted, of a real Norse incursion far beyond Lanceau Meadows? Other alleged artifacts, like the Maine penny, an 11th century Norse coin found at a Native American site in Brooklyn, Maine, complicate the picture. Though its presence might be explained through centuries of trade and movement, it nonetheless raises a tantalizing possibility that Viking contact with the Americas may have been broader and longer lasting than we once believed. Despite decades of research, no second confirmed Norse site has ever been found in North America. No longhouses beneath New England farms. No ship burials in the Hudson River Valley. And yet the sagas persist, full of vivid detail and strange consistency, describing journeys up rivers, skirmishes with native tribes, and seasonal returns to Greenland. Could the colony have failed quickly? Its people killed in conflict, absorbed by indigenous communities, or lost to starvation and disease? Or did it simply never rise beyond a few seasonal camps and scouting parties, leaving behind no durable trace? More speculative voices raise other possibilities. Some suggest the Norse may have traveled southward, establishing a settlement in what is now the northeastern United States. Others believe that signs of their presence have been misidentified or ignored, misattributed to later colonial activity or natural features. Still others wonder if the Norse, in a world not yet dominated by rigid borders and documented conquests, became something else entirely, merged into the mythologies and oral traditions of Native American groups, their cultural footprint scattered like seeds across time. Indeed, in certain indigenous legends, particularly among the Algonquin and Mi'kmaq, there are stories of pale-skinned visitors arriving from the east in great wooden canoes. Some are welcomed, others bring violence. Are these garbled echoes of Viking contact or simply coincidental motifs repeated across cultures worldwide? The evidence remains stubbornly elusive. Perhaps the Norse presence in North America was always destined to be ephemeral, a ghost of empire that brushed the edge of a continent before fading back into the sea. Or perhaps we have not yet looked in the right places or asked the right questions. What would it mean to find the lost colony? To uncover a buried hall in a remote forest or stumble upon a runestone weathered by time but legible still? How would such a discovery reshape our understanding of history and our assumptions about who first laid eyes on this land from across the ocean? For now, the mystery endures, in the sagas, in the soil, and in the cold quiet where the past hides just beneath the surface. Was there once a Norse settlement beyond the northern coasts, deeper in the heart of this continent? Or have we already found all that remains of their great westward journey? Just beyond the worn edge of a forest trail in the American Midwest, a moss-covered stone leans against the earth as if it had been placed with purpose, or perhaps forgotten by time itself. Carved into its surface are strange, angular symbols, marks that resemble ancient letters, seemingly deliberate yet cryptic. Their form is unmistakable, runes. Not far away, in scattered corners of the world, from the windswept shores of Greenland to the riverbanks of Russia and deep into the North American heartland, similar markings have emerged. Some are etched into stone, others scratched into metal or wood or bone. They are relics. Or are they? Runes, symbols used in early Germanic writing systems, are deeply associated with Norse culture. In Scandinavia, they adorned memorial stones, weapons, tools, and talismans. Some bore the names of warriors and kings. Others offered prayers, invocations, or warnings. And some remained stubbornly undeciphered, their meanings lost to the shifting tides of language and time. But while thousands of rune stones and artifacts have been found across Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, it is the rarer, more isolated discoveries outside Scandinavia that provoke the deepest curiosity and the greatest debate. How did runes appear in places where no permanent Norse presence has been confirmed? Were they left by traders, explorers, settlers, or by those seeking to rewrite history? Take, for instance, the controversial Kensington runestone, discovered in 1898 by a Swedish-American farmer in Minnesota. The stone is engraved with a lengthy runic inscription. The text claims to recount a 14th-century Norse expedition into the interior of North America, decades before Columbus set sail. The weathered slab reads like a diary entry, detailing a journey, a tragedy, and a plea for remembrance. For over a century, the Kensington stone has sparked fierce debate. Linguists and historians have pointed to inconsistencies in grammar and vocabulary, suggesting it was carved in the 19th century, possibly as a hoax or folk artifact. Yet others argue that it contains archaic runic forms that would have been difficult to fake at the time of its discovery. Could it be a misunderstood relic of genuine Norse presence deep within the continent? Then there's the Spirit Pond runestones, discovered in Maine in 1971. These small stones bear runic inscriptions, some resembling medieval Norse, others more ambiguous. Like the Kensington stone, they are often dismissed as modern forgeries, and yet their very existence raises questions. Why would someone go to such lengths to inscribe runes in such remote locations? Further afield, in Greenland, the Valsey Church ruins, part of the Norse settlements that once flourished there, contain runic graffiti carved into the stone walls. These are considered authentic, created by Norse inhabitants during the colony's height. They offer names, symbols, and even simple messages left by travelers and farmers. But they also hint at something more: a literate culture capable of preserving memory across vast distances. In the British Isles, particularly in the Orkneys and northern Scotland, runes appear more frequently. This comes as little surprise. Vikings occupied these regions for centuries. But even here, not all inscriptions are easily explained. Some seem out of place in time or disconnected from known settlements. One of the most enigmatic examples lies in Novgorod, Russia. Here, buried in the cold, marshy soil, archaeologists have found birch bark documents bearing runic inscriptions, hinting at Norse presence within trading routes that stretched deep into Eastern Europe. Were these merchants, mercenaries, settlers, or something else? And then there are the less publicized stones, alleged discoveries that have never been fully verified. Whispered accounts of runes found in Oklahoma, in Canada's Labrador coast, and even along the Mississippi River have emerged over the decades. Most are based on hearsay, unclear photographs, or relics that have since disappeared. Still, they linger in the background, unconfirmed, but not entirely dismissed. What connects these scattered discoveries? Are they mere coincidences? The work of 19th and 20th century Scandinavian immigrants who carved their heritage into stone as a tribute to their ancestors? Or are we glimpsing the final echoes of Norse exploration, breadcrumbs scattered across a continent that once lay on the edge of a fading memory? For every expert who confidently declares a runestone a fake, there is another who urges caution. Absence of proof, they argue, is not proof of absence. History is often written by what we find, not necessarily by what existed. It's important to remember that runes were not simply letters. They were symbols of power, of mysticism, of identity. To the Vikings, they carried both secular and sacred meaning. They were carved with intent. And when they appear far from the icy fjords and Nordic meadows where they were born, that intent demands investigation. Could some of these inscriptions represent long-lost outposts, settlements that never took root, but left behind traces of contact? Could others be the remnants of Norse individuals who traveled far beyond the bounds of the known Viking world? Merchants on secret routes, or warriors seeking exile? Or is it possible that some stones, regardless of origin, reflect the desire of later generations to connect themselves to something older, more legendary, to etch themselves into the myth of Viking endurance? As scholars continue to study these enigmatic markings, the lines between hoax, homage, and history remain blurred. What we're left with is not a conclusion, but a landscape of uncertainty. Stones that speak in forgotten tongues, waiting for their meaning to be unearthed once more. So we ask again, when runes appear where they should not be, what are they truly telling us? And what other messages might still lie hidden, beneath the soil, behind a wall, or lost among the trees, waiting for eyes that can finally understand them? In a quiet museum display case, barely larger than the palm of a hand, lies a pendant of weathered silver, its edges softened by time, its form both simple and profound. Suspended from a delicate loop is the unmistakable shape of a hammer, not just any hammer, but Mjolnir, the weapon of the god Thor, a symbol of strength, protection, and power. This object is one of hundreds discovered across the former Viking world. Found in graves, hoards, and occasionally lost in fields or riverbeds, Viking Age amulets appear in a variety of shapes: hammers, axes, miniature swords, animals, faces, runes, and abstract symbols. Some are finely crafted from silver or bronze, others rudimentary, cast in lead or carved from bone. But what exactly were these objects meant to do? At first glance, they appear to be personal adornments, jewelry worn for aesthetic or cultural reasons. And indeed, many amulets were likely prized for their beauty, their craftsmanship, or the prestige of the material. But beneath the surface lies a deeper, more elusive question. Were these items merely decorative, or did they hold power? Historical context provides some clues. The Viking Age, spanning roughly from the late 8th to the early 11th century AD, was a time of great change across Scandinavia. Old Norse pagan beliefs were beginning to encounter and at times collide with Christianity. This cultural and spiritual crossroads is reflected in the objects people left behind. Take the ubiquitous Thor's hammer amulets. These pendants became especially popular during the 10th century, coinciding with the growing presence of Christian crosses in the region. Some scholars suggest the hammer was worn as a countersymbol to the cross, an affirmation of traditional Norse identity in the face of foreign influence. Others propose a more fluid reading in which Thor's hammer and the Christian cross existed side by side, perhaps even worn together by individuals hedging their bets in uncertain times. But Thor's hammer is only one type of amulet. Archaeologists have uncovered miniature axes, possibly invoking the god Freyr, amulets shaped like human figures, animal heads, and mysterious objects with no clear symbolic reference. Some pendants depict tiny chairs, possibly referencing the high seats of Norse chieftains or the divine thrones of the gods. Others are small bells, rings, or pendants inscribed with runes. Were these items charms for luck, protection, fertility, guidance in battle, or safe passage through the underworld? Some graves, particularly those of women, include multiple amulets, often worn together or arranged with care. In certain burials, a combination of pendants appears to form a kind of symbolic toolkit, objects that may have been used by Völur, Seeresses, or women believed to possess prophetic and magical abilities. One famous burial from the island of Gotland included a staff, a Thor's hammer, a crescent-shaped pendant, and small containers that may have once held herbs or ritual substances. Were these the tools of a practitioner of cedar, the ancient Norse form of sorcery and divination? Even more curious are the so-called magical amulets, objects inscribed with runes or patterns believed to convey protection, health, or victory. One bronze pendant found in Denmark bears a runic inscription invoking the power of Odin. Another, recovered from Birka in Sweden, is shaped like a miniature hammer but includes twisted knots and serpent-like engravings, echoing mythological imagery from Viking art. But how were these objects used? Were they activated through ritual, charged with spoken incantations, or did they serve simply as silent companions, their power woven into the material itself? Some scholars have suggested that amulets functioned not unlike modern talismans or religious medallions, worn close to the skin, imbued with personal or communal meaning, and perhaps believed to ward off harm, attract fortune, or mark one's allegiance to a particular deity. Yet there is still no universal answer. For some, an amulet may have been a mark of identity, a visible reminder of one's place within a tribe, a lineage, or a belief system. For others, it may have been intensely personal, tied to dreams, omens, or ancestral spirits. And then there are those amulets whose purpose seems entirely obscure. In 2014, a small lead object was found in a burial mound near Jelling, Denmark. Oval-shaped, barely more than an inch long, it bears a series of cryptic runes arranged in spirals and lines, unlike any known formula. Some interpret it as a protective charm, others as a curse, or even a love spell. But no consensus has been reached. It remains a message without a key, its meaning buried alongside its maker. Even the materials used offer their own enigmas. Why are some amulets cast in humble lead, a metal often associated with alchemy and death? Why do others appear in gold, or incorporate bits of amber, quartz, or animal bone? Do these choices reflect status or belief, or something else entirely? Speculative theories abound. Some have linked amulets to ancient Indo-European traditions of object magic passed down through oral lore. Others suggest their designs encode cosmological information, maps of the 9 Norse worlds, or diagrams of the world tree, Yggdrasil. And still others see in these small objects evidence of a civilization far more spiritually complex than we often imagine, a people for whom the boundary between myth and reality was porous, and the smallest pendant could be a conduit between realms. The mystery of Viking Age amulets lies not only in what they were, but in what they were believed to be. Were they worn to protect a sailor from drowning, or a warrior from death? Did they guide the soul in dreams, or unlock the secrets of fate? Were they prayers cast in metal, or spells in miniature? We may never know exactly what their makers intended. But as we look into the glass cases of museums, or the open earth of excavated graves, we're reminded that meaning is not always lost. Sometimes it waits. What other symbols lie buried, their power forgotten, their language silent? For now, the wind moves gently across the grassy plains of Jutland, Denmark. Near the small town of Jelling, 2 massive stones rise from the earth like sentinels of a forgotten age. Their surfaces are rough with time, their faces carved with sinuous lines and cryptic inscriptions. One bears an intricately tangled serpent encircling a runic message. The other displays an image both arresting and revolutionary, a crucified Christ, arms extended, framed by curling vines. This is not a simple marker. This is the Jelling stone, often called Denmark's birth certificate. Set between 2 immense burial mounds and a surrounding ship-shaped stone setting, the Jelling stones have long been considered among the most significant monuments of the Viking Age. They are attributed to King Gorm the Old and his son, Harald Bluetooth, 2 of the most pivotal figures in Danish history. But these stones are more than memorials. They are statements, declarations, symbols of power, transition, and intent. But what message were they truly meant to send? The smaller of the 2 stones was likely erected around the mid-10th century by Gorm in honor of his wife Thyra. Its inscription is brief and personal. King Gorm made this monument in memory of Thyra, his wife, Denmark's adornment. Yet even here, the political undertone is evident. Thyra is not just a beloved wife. She is described as Danmarker Bot, Denmark's salvation, or Denmark's strength. The language implies unity, territory, a kingdom, not just a kinship. The larger, more famous stone was raised by Harald Bluetooth, Gorm's son. The inscription is more assertive and sweeping. King Harald ordered this monument made in memory of Gorm, his father, and Thyra, his mother. That Harald who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. It is a bold claim, military conquest, cultural transformation, and dynastic legitimacy, all etched in stone. But here lies the mystery. How much of this declaration is fact, and how much is carefully crafted political propaganda? Historical records tell us that Harald Bluetooth ruled during a period of immense change. The Norse world was beginning to shift from its pagan roots toward the Christian faith. The lines of tribal control were hardening into the beginnings of nation-states. Power was increasingly centralized. Trade routes expanded. The old gods were still revered, but new forces were on the horizon. To many scholars, the Jelling stones represent this turning point. They are not just grave markers. They are tools of messaging, carefully constructed instruments of authority. Carved in stone, they proclaim Harald's control over a vast realm and his embrace of the Christian faith. But here's the question. Did Harald truly convert the Danes? Or did he simply declare it? There is little evidence that mass conversion occurred immediately after the monument was raised. Many archaeological sites show that pagan practices continued well into the 11th century, sometimes alongside Christian ones. Burial customs, for example, show signs of blending, graves with Christian crosses and Thor's hammers buried together. Churches were built, yes, but often on top of earlier pagan sacred sites. Was this syncretism, or a subtle contest of power? And what of the image of Christ on the larger Jelling stone? It is stylistically Norse. Christ is not shown suffering, as in later medieval depictions, but rather standing tall and triumphant. His arms are outstretched like a warrior, framed by curling tendrils more reminiscent of the world tree than the biblical vine. Is this a Christian symbol, or a reinterpreted Norse one? A visual compromise between old and new? Some scholars believe the stones were part of a larger royal agenda, to legitimize Harold's rule over a diverse population and claim divine sanction in the process. Others point to the way the stones integrate Norse artistic motifs with Christian iconography as a sign of a calculated transition, not a spiritual revelation. Was this monument a sincere expression of belief, or a political maneuver? More speculative voices suggest that the Jelling complex, complete with mounds, stones, and ship-shaped settings, may have encoded older cosmological ideas, that the arrangement of these elements reflects not only dynastic power, but a sacred geometry, echoing the Norse cosmos itself. The ship, often associated with passage to the afterlife, frames the mounds like a vessel sailing through eternity. The inscriptions, in this view, are not just for the living. They are messages to the gods, or perhaps to the ages. Still others question the chronological narrative. If Harold truly unified Denmark and Christianized it, where is the broader evidence? Are there missing links, lost churches, vanished settlements, suppressed records? Or did Harold's declaration on stone simply outlast the reality on the ground? The Jelling stones remain silent. Their runes speak boldly, but without footnotes. They offer a message, crafted, curated, and carved with unmistakable intent. But the truth behind that message remains layered and elusive. How much of what we read in stone reflects reality? And how much reflects ambition? Were these stones the sincere proclamations of a king reshaping his realm? Or the first great monuments of spin? The landscape around them is quiet now. Tourists walk between the mounds, cameras in hand, unaware that they are treading across one of the most powerful crossroads of faith, language, and nationhood in Northern Europe. The stones stand where they always have, still, dignified, defiant, and the questions they raise remain as enduring as the granite itself. What did Harold Bluetooth really want us to believe? And what truths still lie hidden beneath these ancient words, waiting to be read anew? As we leave the solemn granite of Jelling behind, the bold proclamations of kings etched into stone, we shift our gaze toward a quieter, more intimate mystery, not one of royal declaration, but of silent burial, a mystery entombed beneath the earth for over 1,000 years, waiting. Nestled in the coastal landscape of southern Norway, near the fjord of Sandefjord, lies a grassy burial mound that once concealed one of the most remarkable Viking discoveries ever made. In 1880, when Norwegian farmers began excavating a rising hill on their land, they could hardly have imagined what they would find beneath the soil: a perfectly preserved Viking ship, resting like a sleeping beast in its earthen chamber. It would become known as the Gokstad ship, a long, sleek vessel of oak, nearly 24 meters in length. Its curved hull and fine craftsmanship speak of power and purpose, designed for speed and long voyages across the sea. But it was not sailing when it was found. It was resting. A ship made not for raiding or trade, but for carrying its owner into the afterlife. The burial chamber within the ship held a body, surrounded by weapons, tools, household goods, and sacrificed animals: 2 peacocks, horses, dogs. Signs of immense wealth and prestige. For over a century, this individual was believed to be a man, a warrior chieftain, perhaps even a king. The skeleton was large, robust. Fragments of armor lay nearby. It seemed to fit. But what if the body was not that of a man? Recent reanalysis of the remains based on more advanced forensic techniques has reopened the question. Some experts have suggested that the pelvis and skull may in fact belong to a woman. Tall, yes, but not unusually so for the period. The lack of facial hair, the proportions of the bone structure. Is it possible that the Gokstad burial, one of the most iconic Viking graves ever unearthed, belonged not to a warrior king, but to a noblewoman? And if so, who was she? We know that Viking women, especially those of high status, could wield significant influence. The famed Oseberg burial, discovered just a few years later, contained 2 women, one of whom was likely a Völva, or Seeresses. That ship was richly decorated, its carvings intricate, its offerings lavish. The Gokstad ship is more martial, more austere, but no less significant. Could the woman buried in the Gokstad ship have been a ruler in her own right? A matriarch of a powerful clan? A spiritual leader, warrior, or queen? And what does it mean if we have misunderstood her identity for more than a century? The presence of exotic goods like peacocks, non-native to Scandinavia, suggests extensive trade networks and a wide-reaching influence. The placement of the body in a grand ship surrounded by valuable grave goods indicates deep reverence. Whoever this person was, their death warranted an offering that blended spectacle and sacred rite. But the true identity remains unknown. No inscription, no runestone, no name passed down in saga, just a silent form reduced to bone, wrapped in shadow. Some have speculated that the burial could represent an effort to project power, a political act as much as a funerary one. Was this a way to assert dynastic continuity, a claim to sacred ancestry, or a symbolic return to the sea, the great pathway between worlds in Norse cosmology? Others propose more esoteric ideas, that the peacocks, symbols of immortality in other cultures, were not mere curiosities, but carefully chosen companions for the journey to the afterlife. That the ship itself may have been a kind of floating shrine, linked to mythological ships like Skidbladnir or Naglfar, vessels that crossed realms and fates. There is also the question of what was missing. Grave robbers had long since disturbed the chamber before archaeologists arrived. Could written materials have once lain beside the body? A sword of particular lineage? A pendant or amulet marking priesthood or kinship to a god? We may never know. In the silence of the burial chamber, all that remains are fragments. A length of timber, a carved post, a hollowed rib. Echoes of a life that once held command over lands, over people, or perhaps over spirits. The modern Gokstad ship rests now in a museum near Oslo, a stunning testament to Viking craftsmanship and belief. Tourists gaze at its sweeping hull, unaware that its occupant may yet challenge what we think we know about Viking society, gender roles, and power. And still, the question lingers. Who was the woman, if indeed it was a woman, laid to rest with such majesty? What story was buried alongside her, unspoken and unread? As we stare into the shadowed curve of the ship's interior, the lines between fact and speculation begin to blur. We're left with a profound sense of wonder and a growing awareness that many of the greatest Viking mysteries may lie not in distant sagas or mythic feats, but in the earth beneath our feet. What other truths have we mistaken for legends? As we leave the fjords of Norway and the silent shadows of the Gokstad ship behind, we cross the waters of the Baltic Sea to the windswept coast of the island of Saaremaa in present-day Estonia. Here, in a quiet patch of soil just beyond the village of Salme, the ground held a secret for over a millennium. A secret of ships, of warriors, of violence, and of something altogether strange. It began in 2008, Construction workers leveling ground for a new cable trench uncovered a curious line of stones. Beneath them, ancient timber, bones, and iron. Archaeologists were called in. What followed was one of the most extraordinary Viking Age discoveries in recent memory. 2 wooden ships, buried side by side, dating back to the early 8th century AD. No nails held their planks, only iron rivets and the tension of expert craftsmanship. They were small by Viking standards, only about 11 meters long, but still unmistakably Norse in design. This alone was remarkable. But it was what they contained that deepened the mystery. Inside were the remains of 41 men. Some were piled atop one another. Others had clearly been carefully positioned. Almost all bore the marks of violent death. Sword cuts, crushed skulls, embedded arrowheads. Yet many were also buried with grave goods, gaming pieces, swords, ornate bridles, and whetstones from Norway. One had a gilded sword. Another wore a cloak fastened with an elaborate brooch. This was not a hasty battlefield burial. It was ceremonial, intentional, and undeniably violent. The sight posed questions from the start. Who were these men? What brought them here, so far from home? And who buried them? Comrades, survivors, or their enemies? Radiocarbon dating and isotopic analysis soon provided some answers. The men were Scandinavian, most likely from central Sweden. Their teeth told of cold northern origins. Their gear suggested elite status. They were not simple raiders or fishermen. They were warriors, possibly nobles, armed and dressed as if prepared for both battle and death. But what happened to them? There is no clear sign of a defensive position, no nearby settlement, no rival burial ground. The cause of death was brutal, but the manner of burial was meticulous. This paradox lies at the heart of the Salme mystery, an apparent massacre, followed by an act of reverence. Some believe this was an early Viking raid gone wrong, that these men set out across the sea, seeking glory, wealth, or revenge, but met fierce resistance upon reaching the Estonian shore. Slaughtered in battle, their bodies were later buried by the victors, perhaps as a gesture of respect, or even superstition. But there are problems with this interpretation. Why bury the enemy with such care? Why honor them with grave goods? Why position some of the corpses with such attention, placing weapons at their sides, aligning them in rows? These are not the gestures of victors mocking the vanquished. They are signs of ritual, of familiarity, perhaps even of mourning. A more speculative theory suggests this was not a raid, but a diplomatic mission, or a dynastic expedition. Could these have been warriors escorting a royal figure, a bride, or an ambassador? Some scholars point to the presence of elaborate gear, like the ornate sword, suggesting the involvement of high-ranking individuals. Was this a peaceful journey that erupted into conflict? Or could there be an even deeper mystery? Some researchers have begun to wonder whether the Salme ships represent a tale of betrayal, that these men were killed not by foreigners, but by others of their kind. Perhaps an internal dispute, a feud or political rivalry that ended in blood. The presence of so many noble-looking warriors together, far from home, raises the possibility of interfactional conflict. Could they have turned on one another? Or been ambushed by rivals they believed to be allies? There is also the curious fact that the ships were buried on land, not at sea, not burned as in many other traditions. They were placed in the earth, side by side, like tombs, as if the ships themselves were part of the ceremony, vessels not just for sailing but for carrying souls to the next world. And then there is the matter of the animals. At least one bird of prey, a hawk or falcon, was found buried with the dead. In Norse culture, such animals held symbolic meaning. Messengers, guides between realms, symbols of Odin himself. Was the bird a pet, a totem, or a spiritual escort? Some archaeologists have even floated mythological comparisons. Do the Salme ships echo the ancient tales of Valhalla, the hall where fallen warriors feast eternally? Is this burial site a real-world reflection of that ideal? 41 warriors, fallen together, crossing to the afterlife aboard the very ships that brought them to their fate. The Estonian landscape today is peaceful, unassuming. A thin line of forest separates the burial site from the gray-blue waves of the Baltic. No stone markers remain, no towering mounds. Just the memory of ships, bones, and a battle without a name. And yet the questions remain. Why were they here? Who buried them? And why were the dead given the respect and honor of a ceremonial resting place in a land that was not their own? As we look out across the calm waters of the Baltic, we are reminded that the Viking world was far more interconnected, more complex, and more human than legend alone suggests. The Salme ships whisper of ambition, of conflict, of brotherhood, and of something still just out of reach. What secrets lie beneath other patches of unremarkable soil? And what other stories, untold, unmarked, still drift beneath the waves? The mists of the Baltic recede behind us, and we sail once more toward the mist-laden hills and river valleys of Anglo-Saxon England. Here, in the darkened folds of the 9th century, something ominous stirs in the chronicles of monks and the ruins of forgotten strongholds. It is not the sound of a raiding party or a coastal skirmish, but the steady, thunderous advance of something far greater. A great host, an army unlike anything the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had yet faced. They called it the Great Heathen Army, a term laced with fear, otherness, and a sense of divine judgment. In 865 AD, this vast coalition of Norse warriors descended upon the shores of East Anglia, not for a raid, but for conquest. And for over a decade, they swept across the land, tearing through kingdoms, installing puppet rulers, and seizing the heart of England. But then, something happened. By the dawn of the 10th century, the great army, so formidable, so relentless, had all but vanished. How does an army of thousands simply disappear? The story begins with names. Legendary names. Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ubba. These were no ordinary warriors. According to some sources, they were the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok himself, seeking vengeance for his death at the hands of the Northumbrians. Yet the historical evidence is fragmented, a mix of annals, sagas, and conjecture. Still, the consequences of their arrival were very real. In just a few short years, they toppled Northumbria, razed York, and struck fear deep into the heart of Mercia. They wintered in fortified camps, an unusual tactic for Viking forces, and made coordinated movements across vast territories. This was a military campaign of remarkable scope. Yet its documentation is maddeningly incomplete. By 878 AD, King Alfred of Wessex had managed to strike back. At the Battle of Edington, he forced the Viking leader Guthrum into submission. The result was the Treaty of Wedmore, and with it, the division of England into the Danelaw and Anglo-Saxon territories. It was a peace of sorts, but the army was not gone. It had merely shifted. For years after, we hear echoes of their movements. Some of the army sailing to East Anglia, others reportedly marching into Northumbria. Some seem to vanish into settled life, becoming farmers, landholders, perhaps even local rulers. But others simply disappear from the record. So what became of the Great Heathen Army? One theory, grounded in archaeology, suggests a slow assimilation. Recent discoveries, such as the mass burial at Repton, hint at disease, battle losses, and logistical strain. Excavations at the site revealed the remains of nearly 300 individuals, most of them young men, interred with weapons and coins dating to the 870s. Was this a plague? A final stand? Or just one chapter in a longer, more fragmented tale? Other sites, like the mass graves at Heath Wood, point to cremations, possibly high-status individuals burned in accordance with Norse ritual. These burial practices seem to shift over time, blending Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon elements. Did the warriors gradually merge into the communities they once sought to dominate? The lack of a decisive battle marking their end is telling. No grand clash, no written surrender, no saga-ending finale. Only the slow fading of references, like echoes retreating into fog. Some suggest the army fractured, its leaders pursuing separate ambitions. There is evidence that a portion of the army sailed to Ireland, becoming part of the Norse Gaelic conflicts that would shape Dublin and its surrounding territories. Others may have turned to Francia, where Viking war bands were already pressuring the Seine and Loire. Could the Great Army have been less a unified force than a series of loosely connected bands, dispersing and reforming across a volatile political landscape? Then there are the more speculative theories. Could a portion of the army have traveled even farther west, toward the unexplored reaches of the Atlantic? Theories connecting Viking voyages to North America, while tantalizing, remain inconclusive. Still, when viewed alongside sagas like the saga of the Greenlanders or Eric the Red's saga, one wonders, could the spirit of the Great Army, the drive to expand, to conquer, have seeded those later expeditions? There are even whispers in folk memory of Norse integration so complete that names and customs vanished into the local dialect, leaving only faint linguistic footprints behind. Place names ending in by and thorpe, common across northern and eastern England, suggest deep and lasting Viking influence. But do these remnants speak of settlers, or former soldiers who laid down their blades? Curiously, the Christian sources that once chronicled the army with such fear and vivid detail eventually fall silent. Were the chroniclers content to see their foes absorbed, baptized, and converted? Or were they simply unable or unwilling to trace a story that had become too complex, too interwoven with their own? Today, the term Great Heathen Army conjures images of chaos and fury, but beneath that fearsome exterior lies something more organized, more strategic, and perhaps more enigmatic. What binds a coalition like this together? Gold? Blood? Vengeance? And once those causes are spent, what remains? As we look to the quiet fields of Repton, the softly rolling hills of East Anglia, or the layered soil beneath York, we sense a story not yet fully told, not erased but concealed, fragmented across bone, iron, and silence. The Great Heathen Army did not simply vanish. It dissolved, like fog into the morning light, leaving behind only scattered traces. Traces that challenge us to ask, what happens when war becomes home? And how many warriors still lie beneath the soil, unnamed, unmarked, still guarding the last secrets of an army that once threatened to reshape a kingdom, and then without warning disappeared? From the cold mists of Anglo-Saxon England, we now follow the fading wake of the Viking longship as it carves its way through a different world, southward, down the great rivers of Eastern Europe, past thick forests and Slavic villages, past marshes that never dry, into a realm not of raiding and conquest, but of exchange, negotiation, and wonder. And somewhere along this journey, between the icy shores of Scandinavia and the golden cities of the Abbasid Caliphate, the Norse came face to face with a civilization vastly different from their own, and yet strangely intertwined. Viking contact with the Islamic world is one of the most surprising and least understood chapters in Norse history. The clues are subtle, scattered across time and territory. One of the most striking is a single coin, no larger than a thumbnail, buried in the soil of a Swedish farm. Its Arabic script is unfamiliar to Scandinavian eyes, yet it carries a name. Muhammad is the messenger of God. It is a silver dirham, minted nearly 2,000 miles away in the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, what is today Iraq, and it is not alone. Across Scandinavia, in grave sites, hoards, and riverbeds, thousands of these Islamic dirhams have been found. Some have been pierced as pendants, others stacked in rings. Many are part of treasures buried during times of strife, never recovered by their owners. These silver coins, once part of Islamic markets and merchant stalls, ended up in the hands of Norse traders, warriors, and chieftains. But how? The answer lies in the geography of the rivers. The Viking Rus, a Scandinavian people who settled and ruled parts of what is now Russia, established vast trade routes stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and the Caspian. They traveled down the Volkhov, the Dnieper, and the Volga rivers. Along these watery arteries, they transported furs, honey, amber, and slaves, goods highly prized in the East. In return, they received silks, spices, glass, and, most notably, silver. At the heart of this exchange was the city of Baghdad, one of the most advanced and cosmopolitan cities of the 9th and 10th centuries. Though no Viking is known to have reached it directly, they dealt with merchants who did. The Abbasid Caliphate, rich and far-reaching, became an unexpected source of Norse wealth. But silver is only part of the story. In the Swedish town of Birka, archaeologists uncovered an extraordinary textile fragment embroidered with Arabic Kufic script. One controversial reading of the pattern suggests it may spell the word Allah, God. The idea was met with skepticism. Was it a misinterpretation, a coincidence of design? Or could it imply something deeper, an awareness, however faint, of Islamic belief? Some historians argue this is evidence of cultural osmosis, not conversion. That Viking traders adapted styles and symbols for prestige, not piety. Yet others ask whether such artifacts hint at more complex interactions. Did Norse merchants adopt elements of Eastern dress or ritual to smooth trade? Could belief systems, however distantly, have begun to blur? Then there is the grave of a woman found in Birka, dressed in fine Eastern silks with silver dirhams at her side. Her attire suggests long-distance travel, or at least deep commercial ties. But her exact role remains unclear. Was she a local elite with a taste for imported goods? A foreign merchant's wife? Or something else entirely? And what of the Vikings themselves? Arabic sources describe them too, but from the outside. The 10th century Muslim geographer Ibn Fadlan recorded his encounters with a people he called the Rusiya along the Volga. He was simultaneously horrified and fascinated. He described their hygiene, their elaborate ship burials, their imposing stature and pagan rituals. One of the most haunting passages recounts the funeral of a Rus chieftain, a rite involving human sacrifice, song, and flame. To Ibn Fadlan, the Rus were both exotic and barbaric, but his writings reveal something deeper, that the Vikings were not just traders, but cultural ambassadors, unwitting or not, bringing their world into contact with another. Still, many questions linger. Why do we find Islamic coins in such large quantities in the north, but so few signs of Norse presence in the south? Were Viking traders tolerated by the Caliphate, or merely the last link in a long commercial chain? Were they guests, or ghosts, in the market? Some scholars propose that most of these exchanges happened through intermediaries, Khazar or Bulgar merchants who met the Norse at river junctions and borders. Others believe Norse traders ventured far deeper into the Islamic world than the written record suggests, leaving only material traces behind. And perhaps the most tantalizing mystery of all, could these interactions have influenced Viking society more than we realize? Did exposure to distant lands and refined cultures alter Norse politics, religion, or even art? Could the sagas, oral histories filled with exotic lands, magic, and treasure, contain faint echoes of Eastern journeys long forgotten? Even today, our understanding of Viking Islamic trade is evolving. New metal detection finds, reassessments of ancient texts, fresh translations of forgotten manuscripts. Each discovery opens a door, but also reveals the vastness of what we do not know. As we hold a single silver coin in our hands, its surface worn by time, its origin in a distant desert city, we are reminded of a truth too often overlooked, that the Viking world was not a world apart. It was a world in motion, a world of travelers and translators, warriors and merchants, myth and memory. And somewhere, between frost-bound fjords and the golden domes of the East, a story still waits to be told. What else lies buried along the rivers? What unseen hands passed silver across unseen borders? And what forgotten journeys remain etched not in books, but in the quiet, persistent riddle of trade? And yet, as Viking ships returned from distant markets with foreign silver and silks, they also left behind something less tangible, but no less enduring. Not goods, not artifacts, but something woven deep into the blood and bone of the people they touched. A silent inheritance passed down through generations. Far from the bustling souks of the Abbasid Caliphate and the river routes of the Rus, there lies another, quieter realm of Viking influence. Windswept, rugged, isolated. Places where the sea is ever present, and history clings like mist to the landscape. The North Atlantic Islands, the Orkneys, the Shetlands, the Faroes, even the western Isles of Scotland. To the casual eye, these are merely remote outposts, fragments of land scattered like stepping stones across gray waters. But buried in their soil, etched into their surnames and hidden in their DNA, are hints of a past both surprising and unresolved. It begins, not with myth or saga, but with science. In recent decades, advances in genetic testing have allowed researchers to peer into the deep ancestry of populations, and what they've found has reshaped our understanding of Viking expansion. These weren't only marauders or merchants. They were settlers, colonizers, families. In the Orkney Islands, for example, up to 60% of the male Y chromosome lines show clear Scandinavian origins. That is not the trace of a passing fleet. It is the mark of deep-rooted settlement. The Norse did not merely raid these shores. They came to stay. But how far did they go? In the Faroes, researchers studying ancient sheep dung, yes, dung, discovered that Norse settlers may have arrived as early as the year 500 AD, centuries before traditional histories suggest. Does this mean the Vikings, or Proto-Vikings, were island hopping across the North Atlantic long before their supposed age of expansion began? And if so, who were they? Similar genetic echoes appear in Iceland, where the majority of male settlers were of Norse origin, but surprisingly, many of the women were not. Instead, mitochondrial DNA suggests that a significant number of the founding women came from the British Isles, possibly captives, wives, or allies brought from raids and settlements in Ireland or Scotland. This mingling of bloodlines raises haunting questions. Were these unions consensual, opportunistic, or simply the brutal arithmetic of migration? And the mystery deepens as we move west. On the Isle of Lewis, where peat bogs stretch endlessly across an austere horizon, locals sometimes speak of ancient ancestors with fair hair and strange customs. Is this just folklore? or a living echo of Viking past. Some linguistic clues remain. Place names of Norse origin still cling to the landscape, but the bloodline is harder to trace. Even more unexpected is the case of Greenland. Norse colonies existed here for centuries, yet their genetic imprint appears strangely faint. Why? Did they vanish without leaving descendants? Or have they been absorbed so completely into the Inuit populations or later European arrivals that the signal has been lost? Then there is the island of Newfoundland. While Lance aux Meadows has confirmed a Norse presence in North America, its scale and permanence remain unclear. No human remains have yet been found, no graves to sequence, no bones to test. But what if that changes? What if, buried beneath centuries of earth and pine, there lies a child of both Viking and native lineage? Would that rewrite history? And what of the tales told in hushed tones in parts of Scotland and Ireland? Rumors of long-lost Norse cousins, of families whose roots run deeper than they knew. Genetic surveys continue to uncover unsuspected Scandinavian markers in remote communities. But genetics, like runes, can be interpreted in many ways. A shared haplogroup does not always reveal a shared story. Some believe the answers lie not just in DNA, but in behavior. Island communities influenced by the Norse often display cultural quirks, styles of governance, law, and even social structure that mirror old Scandinavian models. The Althing in Iceland, the Udal land system in Orkney and Shetland. Did these systems persist because they worked? Or because they were carried by Viking descendants who remembered how things had once been? Of course, not all agree. Some historians argue that genetic legacy is an unreliable measure of cultural influence. Others caution against drawing clean lines between Norse and native, especially in areas where centuries of mixing blur the distinctions. And still, the debate continues. In recent years, DNA sampling has expanded to the Arctic and beyond. Some even suggest that Viking DNA may exist in pockets of North America not yet fully explored. But until more evidence comes to light, these ideas remain speculative, a tantalizing shadow on the edge of what we know. We are left, then, with fragments. A jawbone in a windswept grave, a sequence of nucleotides that points to Norway, a local surname that ends in son with no clear origin. Is that enough to tell a story, or are we reading too much into the genetic mist? In the end, the Viking genetic legacy may not be a single story, but many. Stories of migration and survival, of conquest and assimilation, of unions formed in war or love or necessity. And scattered across the remote islands of the North Atlantic, the whispers of those stories still linger. So the question remains, where else might their blood run? Unseen, unspoken, waiting to be discovered. And if we listen closely, not to the clash of swords or the roar of longships, but to the quiet rhythm of inheritance, what might we hear? From the cold coasts of Orkney to the distant islands of the North Atlantic, the Viking legacy endures in quiet, unexpected ways. Yet for all the genetic and cultural traces left behind, one question echoes louder than most. Not how the Vikings came, but why they stopped. It is early morning on the eastern shores of Lindisfarne. The tide is low, and the cold sea glimmers silver under a pale sun. The ruins of the ancient monastery still stand, windswept and worn by centuries of salt and storm. It was here, in 793 AD, that the Viking Age is said to have begun, with fire, blood, and fear. A brutal assault on a Christian stronghold, etched into monastic chronicles as divine punishment or demonic horror. It marked the arrival of something new, something terrifying. But centuries later, the raiders were gone. From the late 8th to the 11th century, Viking longships roamed wide and far, from Ireland's green coast to the golden shores of Andalusia, from the icy rivers of Rus to the shimmering cities of Constantinople. The Vikings raided monasteries, sacked cities, captured kings, and reshaped entire kingdoms. And then, it stopped. By the early 12th century, the great raids had dwindled. The longships that once struck terror across Europe faded from history's stage. The men who had once carved out empires with axe and sail no longer crossed the seas in search of silver and glory. Why? Historians offer many explanations. Some are practical, some are speculative, all are incomplete. One widely accepted theory points to Christianization. As Norse societies converted to Christianity, their worldview shifted. The old gods, Odin, Thor, Freyja, lost their hold. Valhalla, once the promised reward of a warrior's death, became a forbidden dream. As more Viking leaders embraced the Christian faith, raiding fellow Christians became not only politically dangerous, but spiritually unpalatable. Did the cross tame the axe? Another answer lies in political consolidation. Viking societies, once fragmented into local chieftaincies and petty kingdoms, began to unify. In Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, centralized monarchies emerged. Monarchies that needed taxes more than plunder, administration more than chaos. Organized rule demanded order, not endless war abroad. Then there's the economic argument. In their early years, the Vikings targeted the unguarded treasures of monastic communities: gold, silver, relics. But over time, the element of surprise was lost. Defenses improved. Fortified towns, garrisons, and standing armies made quick raids riskier, less profitable. Trade, on the other hand, was flourishing. The same ships that once carried warriors could now ferry goods: furs, walrus ivory, amber. Why risk your life for plunder when silver could be earned in peace? Still, the timing leaves gaps. Even after conversion and consolidation, some Norse regions continued raiding, sporadically, into the 11th century. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 marked a climactic end for many. There, Harold Hardrada of Norway met his death attempting to conquer England, just days before William of Normandy, himself of Viking descent, arrived to claim the same throne. Was this the last gasp of the Viking warrior spirit? Some scholars argue that the integration of Vikings into European society was so thorough that raiding became obsolete. Norse mercenaries fought in the Byzantine Varangian Guard. Viking descendants ruled over Normandy and Sicily. Their identities blurred, their ambitions transformed. They didn't vanish, they adapted. And yet, other voices whisper of deeper, less visible forces. Could climate change have played a role? During the Viking Age, the North Atlantic experienced a relatively warm period, the so-called medieval warm period, which allowed for easier navigation, longer sailing seasons, and more reliable agriculture in marginal areas like Greenland and Iceland. As temperatures cooled again in the 11th and 12th centuries, harsh seas and poor harvests may have constrained long-distance expeditions. Did the weather itself silence the longships? Or perhaps it wasn't just about geopolitics or climate, but about identity. The Viking Age wasn't just an era of plunder. It was a cultural moment, a way of life born from a convergence of spiritual belief, seafaring skill, and social structure. As those threads unraveled, what remained? If the gods died, the chieftains fell, and the ships stayed moored, was there still a Viking? There are even stranger theories. Some have suggested that Viking raiding was tied to a kind of ritualized economy, where prestige, masculinity, and social standing were earned not just by wealth, but by how that wealth was acquired. In this view, raiding was less about necessity and more about performance, an expression of honor and status in societies where violence was symbolic. If that ritual lost its power through religion, social change, or external pressure, the drive may have simply faded. Others look to fringe ideas, that perhaps unknown catastrophes, plague, famine, or migration, struck communities in ways not fully recorded, or that rival powers, from Slavic kingdoms to expanding Holy Roman realms, effectively boxed in Norse movements. But these ideas remain speculative, their evidence scarce. So, what truly ended the Viking raids? A perfect storm of change? A shift in the soul of the Norse world? Or simply the quiet erosion of an age? Today, the beaches where the longships once landed are calm. The old runestones weather in silence. And across Scandinavia, echoes of the raiders live on, in language, legend, and legacy. But not in war. We can trace their paths. We can follow their bones. But we may never fully grasp the moment when the sails came down and the sword was laid aside. Was it choice or necessity? And what, if anything, might have happened if the Vikings had never stopped? As the age of Viking raids drew to a close, and their sails faded from the European horizon, a quieter question began to take shape. Not one of conquest, but of cartography. Inside Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, behind layers of protective glass and controlled lighting, lies one of the most controversial artifacts in the history of exploration, the Vinland Map. At first glance, it is unassuming. A yellowed parchment, about 11 inches wide, its ink faded but legible. It depicts a medieval view of the world, Europe, Asia, and Africa, all drawn with the distinctive, irregular lines of pre-Renaissance cartographers. But what sets this map apart is not what it shows, but where. On the far left, beyond the familiar contours of Europe and Greenland, lies a landmass labeled Vinlandia Insula, an island in the North Atlantic, a western land, a place, according to the map, that the Norse had reached hundreds of years before Columbus ever sailed from Spain. Could it be real? The Vinland Map first surfaced publicly in 1965, when it was introduced alongside the Tartar Relation, a manuscript bound with it, and a medieval copy of the Speculum Historiale. From the moment it was unveiled, it set off a firestorm of academic debate. If authentic, it would mean that Norse voyages to the Americas were not only real, something already supported by the sagas and archaeological finds like Meadows, but also recognized and mapped in Europe by the mid-15th century. But there was a problem. The map's origins were murky, its ink raised red flags, and its connection to the accompanying texts, both of which could be traced with some confidence, seemed, to many scholars, tenuous at best. Still, the idea was tantalizing. The Vinland Sagas, Icelandic texts written centuries earlier, described Leif Erikson's voyage to a fertile land west of Greenland. They told of wild grapes, self-sown wheat, and sprawling forests, luxuries to a people accustomed to tundra and ice. For years, these stories were considered more legend than fact. Then, in 1960, archaeologists Helge and Anne Steen Ingstad unearthed the remains of a Norse settlement at Meadows in Newfoundland. Suddenly, Vinland was more than myth. It was real, tangible. So, when the Vinland Map appeared, it seemed to offer proof that some in medieval Europe knew of these lands far earlier than previously thought. Or did it? Experts turned to the map's materials. The parchment itself was dated to the mid-15th century, consistent with its supposed origins. But the ink, analyzed under modern techniques, presented complications. In 1974, scientists discovered traces of anatase, a form of titanium dioxide not known to have been used in ink before the 20th century. For many, this was a death blow, a clear indication of forgery. Yet others pushed back. They argued that anatasi can occur naturally, and that contamination, either environmental or accidental, could explain its presence. Further studies, including those using Raman spectroscopy, deepened the debate. Some concluded that the map was a 20th century fabrication. Others insisted the evidence was inconclusive. Even now, decades later, consensus remains elusive. Who would have forged such a map, and why? Was it part of an elaborate hoax designed to elevate Norse discovery over later European claims? Or was it, as some fringe theorists suggest, a long-lost copy of a genuine Norse original passed down through obscure channels? More intriguingly, if it is authentic, what does it tell us about medieval knowledge of the world? The map names Vinland, but without detailed information. It places it near Greenland, but with a geographic vagueness that raises more questions than answers. Could this indicate knowledge derived from oral tradition? A mapmaker working from hearsay rather than first-hand charts? Some have even speculated that the Vinland Map could reflect a blend of truth and medieval imagination, part genuine recollection, part cartographic guesswork, much like the mythical creatures and exaggerated coastlines that filled so many maps of the time. But others point to deeper layers of possibility. What if the Vinland Map was part of a suppressed narrative, one in which Norse discovery of North America threatened dominant historical paradigms and was quietly forgotten or ignored by later chroniclers? A theory often dismissed, yet never entirely silenced. In recent years, a new wave of scientific analysis has attempted to close the book on the debate. A 2021 Yale-led study claimed definitively that the map is a modern forgery, citing synthetic ink components and repeated issues with provenance. For many, that seemed to end the matter. And yet, questions remain. Why go to such lengths to forge something that confirms what Meadows already demonstrated? Why attach it to unrelated medieval texts in such a subtle way? And if it's a hoax, why does it so perfectly reflect the form, style, and knowledge of a 15th century cartographer? Could it be that someone, in the shadowy years before the age of discovery, did glimpse records of a land to the west and preserved that knowledge in the only way they knew how? The Vinland Map sits in its display case, motionless, its edges curled by time, its ink, whether modern or medieval, still holding the shape of an idea that the boundaries of the known world were never quite as fixed as we once believed. Is it a fraud, meticulously constructed to deceive, or a relic of knowledge lost too soon? In the end, perhaps the map's true meaning lies not in its authenticity, but in the questions it continues to raise. What else might have been known, and then forgotten? And what other fragments of that forgotten past might still lie waiting, buried in archives, folded between books, or etched in fading ink, on the edge of the known world? In the dim light of a Scandinavian dawn, the black silhouette of a Viking longship cuts through the coastal mist. Its sail billows with the wind, its carved prow snarling toward distant shores. A crew of warriors stands at the ready, shields slung on their backs, axes gleaming with salt-flecked steel. But among these familiar figures of Norse masculinity, imagine, just for a moment, that not all of them are men. A slender figure lifts a sword, not smaller, not ceremonial, but fully forged, sharpened, ready for war. Could Viking women have sailed into battle? For generations, the image of the Viking warrior has been singular and unmistakable, male, bearded, brutal. Raids across Anglo-Saxon England, Francia, and the Slavic East were long described in sagas and chronicles as the work of fearsome Norsemen. But recent discoveries, both archaeological and genetic, have begun to challenge that narrative. Quietly, persistently, intriguingly. One of the most startling revelations came in 2017, when researchers re-examined a high-status warrior grave from Birka, Sweden. Designated BJ 581, it had long been considered a textbook Viking male burial. The body interred with a sword, axe, spear, armor-piercing arrows, 2 shields, and even a full set of gaming pieces, likely used for tactical planning. For over a century, the assumption was simple. This was a man. But DNA analysis told a different story. The individual buried at Birka was biologically female. The announcement sent ripples through both academic and popular circles. Was this proof of a Viking woman warrior? A leader, perhaps? A shield maiden? Or was something being misinterpreted? Some scholars resisted the idea. Could it be that the grave goods didn't signify combat, but high status? Was this woman a noble figure, perhaps a spiritual authority, buried with symbolic items? But if so, why so many weapons, and of such practical, battlefield-grade design? Others pointed out a different problem: modern imagination. Pop culture had already popularized the concept of the shield maiden, from television dramas to fantasy epics. Could modern bias be reading too much into the evidence? Yet the Birka warrior is not alone. Across the Norse world, there are scattered hints, unresolved, inconclusive, but suggestive, that women may have played more active roles in Viking warfare than once thought. Female graves in Norway, Denmark, and the British Isles have yielded weaponry. Some contain riding gear, consistent with mounted warriors. Others show signs of violent injuries, battle wounds perhaps. In the Icelandic sagas, too, women of formidable spirit appear again and again. Lagertha, the wife and comrade in arms of Ragnar Lothbrok, was said to be as courageous as a man. Freydis Eiríksdóttir, daughter of Eric the Red, famously took up a sword and turned back a group of attackers in Vinland, pregnant at the time. Were these stories symbolic, exaggerated, or based on real women whose roles have been quietly minimized by later chroniclers? Medieval chroniclers, especially those outside the Norse world, often downplayed or dismissed women's participation in warfare. Christian scribes, in particular, had difficulty reconciling warrior women with their own societal norms. The Saxon poet and historian Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, made no mention of female warriors in his accounts of Scandinavia. But absence in a chronicle does not mean absence in reality. Could it be that Viking culture in some times and places allowed or even encouraged women to fight? The legal texts of early medieval Scandinavia offer complex clues. Women had more rights in Norse society than in much of Europe at the time. They could inherit property, divorce their husbands, and run households in their absence. But the laws are mostly silent on matters of battle. Was this because it was rare, or because it was simply accepted? And what of the shield maidens described in sources like Hervarar Saga and Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum? Saxo, writing in Latin from a Christian perspective, claimed that women once took up arms like men, but criticized this as a moral decline. Could his disdain reflect real history remembered in mythic form? Or were these female warriors, if they existed, not part of the mainstream military force, but exceptional figures who stepped forward in moments of crisis? Noble women defending their estates, wives accompanying their husbands on raids, daughters raised in the shadow of iron and fire. There is another dimension, less explored, but equally compelling. Viking cosmology is filled with powerful female figures. The Norns, who spin the fate of all beings. The Valkyries, who choose the slain and guide them to Valhalla. Freya, goddess of both love and war, receives half of all warriors killed in battle. Could these mythic ideals have bled into the social fabric, creating a cultural model where martial women, though not the norm, were not unthinkable? We also cannot ignore the possibility that the lines between genders in martial contexts were simply more fluid than we expect. Perhaps Viking society had a place for women who crossed boundaries, not just in private life but in war. Or perhaps we are trying to fit a wide range of practices across centuries and regions into a single model. Scandinavia in the Viking Age was not one homogeneous block. Customs in 9th century Norway may have differed vastly from those in 11th century Iceland or the Danelaw in England. Ultimately, the role of women in Viking warfare remains an open question, not for lack of clues, but because the evidence is scattered, fragmentary, and elusive. It lies buried in bones, hinted at in runestones, whispered in sagas, and debated in laboratories. Could it be that entire chapters of martial history have been written without half the cast? Or are we chasing legends, confusing exception for rule and poetry for truth? In a world where so many Viking swords have lost their wielders to time, where grave goods speak but cannot explain, we are left with a compelling mystery. How many Viking women, beneath helm and mail, stood side by side with the raiders of history? And how many more still wait in silence, their stories etched in forgotten soil, unseen beneath the passage of centuries?